The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. After their intimate moments, Vasper changed into a sharp, formal suit, meticulously adjusting his necktie in front of the full-body mirror, the rich fabric falling perfectly on his broad shoulders. He moved with a calm precision, yet there was a tension in the air that belied his outward composure. Chanty, standing close by, watched him with a smile that radiated warmth and admiration. Leaning casually against the wall, with a playful glint in her eye, she whispered, "What a handsome man." Her voice was soft but sincere, lilting with genuine admiration. And the compliment made Vasper smile even more, enhancing his already captivating presence, though his eyes remained focused on her reflection in the mirror. Unable to resist the pull between them, Vasper, who had been stealing glances at Chanty all along, finally succumbed to his desire. Vasper turned abruptly, his intense gaze locking onto hers. In an instant, he closed the distance between them, his hands finding her waist and pulling her close with a possessive urgency. He pulled her close, pressing his lips against hers with a hunger that had been simmering since their last encounter. His hands slid down to squeeze her buttocks, reigniting the fire within him. Chanty, in her alluring white mini dress with delicate spaghetti straps, was a vision of irresistible beauty, and her very presence drove him wild. A dress that clung to her curves, the delicate spaghetti straps revealing her smooth shoulders. She was a vision of tantalizing beauty, a goddess draped in simplicity, her long soft brown hair cascading down her back in soft waves. The sight of her ignited something primal within him, despite their recent passionate exchange. Vasper's body was already heating up again, unable to resist the magnetic pull between them. Their lips met in a kiss that was both passionate and demanding, craving the warmth and softness of her. His need for her growing with every second. As they kissed deeply, her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers threading through his hair as the kiss deepened. Vasper's hand gripped her waist with a firm possessiveness. The heat between them was undeniable, a fire that had been stoked to a roaring blaze. Vasper's hands began to wander, sliding up her thighs, inching beneath the fabric of her dress. His touch was electrifying, sending shivers of anticipation through Chanty as his fingers brushed against her panties. Chanty smiled playfully and gently moved Vasper's hand away, her playful smile returning as she broke the kiss. "Vasper," she laughed softly, trying to catch her breath, "you just put on that suit. We can't have it getting all wrinkled now, can we?" Vasper groaned in frustration, tightening his embrace, but she laughed as she wiggled out of his grasp. "Vasper, your suit will get wrinkled, you just changed," she teased, her laughter filling the room. But Vasper, equally amused and undeterred, pulled her back, his voice low and mischievous, his forehead resting against hers as he struggled to regain control. "So what? I'll change again." Chanty couldn't help but laugh at his reply. She giggled, her laughter like music to his ears, and she took a step back, slipping out of his grasp with a mischievous grin. She reminded him, her tone teasing but laced with affection. "You're already so late for your duty, it's almost noon." But Vasper was lost in the moment. He chuckled, the sound deep and rich, though his eyes never left hers. Despite her words, he reached for her again, pulling her back into his arms. His lips found the soft skin of her neck, pressing gentle kisses that made her sigh in pleasure, the heat between them sparking once more. His hands remained on her, unwilling to let her go, his desire for her still pulsing through him. But just as they were about to lose themselves in each other again, Chanty slipped from his embrace, her heart pounding as she ran into the living room. With a quick, playful move, her laughter trailing behind her, Vasper gave chase. He followed her, his movements swift and sure, driven by the unyielding pull he felt towards her. Catching her by the side of the sofa bed, he pulled her close, their momentum causing them to tumble onto the sofa, Chanty beneath him, with Vasper nestled between her thighs. Her breath catching as Vasper's body pressed against hers, his weight a comforting presence. She could feel the heat radiating from him. Their laughter faded, replaced by the heavy breathing and undeniable heat between them. Vasper's eyes were dark with desire, his body pressing down on hers, wanting to claim her again right there and then. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the room silent save for the sound of their labored breathing. Chanty's dress had ridden up during their fall, leaving her legs exposed, her thighs cradling Vasper between them. Chanty could feel his hands gripping her exposed thighs, the contact sending a jolt of electricity through her. Chanty knew they were treading dangerous ground, her voice trembling, her heart racing as she fought to regain control. "Vasper," she whispered, her eyes locked on his, "we really need to stop. You're going to be late." "Get up," she added in a hushed tone, as she met Vasper's intense gaze. "You're going to be late. We'll continue later, okay?" But even as she spoke, her voice trembled with the effort to resist the overwhelming desire building between them. But Vasper's only response was to lower his lips to hers again, his kiss more urgent this time, as if he couldn't get enough of her. Chanty felt herself melting into him, her resolve weakening as the fire between them roared back to life. She could feel the hardness of Vasper's arousal pressing against her, her own body responding despite her resolve. Her thin lace lingerie offered little protection from the sensation of Vasper's firm body against hers, and with her dress bunched up around her waist, her legs were fully exposed to his touch. Vasper, intoxicated by the sight of her, seemed unable to pull away. Instead, their lips met in a scorching kiss, the heat between them blazing anew. Vasper's hands grew more aggressive as he knelt before her, his fingers sliding beneath to remove her panties with a deliberate slowness that left her breathless. Chanty moaned softly, arching into his touch, the sensation overwhelming, spreading her legs open in front of him. His eyes devoured the sight of her, taking in every inch of her, exposing her navel and the curves of her body. He resumed kissing her, his hand lingering between her thighs, causing Chanty to arch her back in pleasure, a deep moan escaping her lips. Vasper groaned in response, as if he wanted to absorb every part of her, to own every breath she took. And then, in a moment of shocking interruption, the intense moment was shattered as the world came crashing back and Jake suddenly teleported into the room. He appeared right next to them, in front of the sofa where they were entangled. Shock rippled through them as they turned to see Jake, who was equally stunned by the scene he had just interrupted. The timing couldn't have been worse. Jake's eyes widening in shock at the scene before him. Chanty, half naked beneath Vasper, screamed in mortification, her voice a mix of terror and embarrassment, as she quickly pulled Vasper's body over hers to shield herself from Jake's view. "Oh my God! Vasper, cover me!" she cried out, her voice high-pitched with panic as she struggled to pull her dress down. The realization that Jake had seen her in such an intimate position sent a wave of mortification crashing over her. Vasper, his face contorted with fury, glared at Jake with a look that could have killed. He glared at Jake, who sat there staring at them. With a growl, Vasper yanked Chanty's dress down to cover her exposed legs, his protective instincts kicking in as he shielded her from Jake's gaze, but the dress is too short, it didn't help. Jake's gaze burning into them both. "You pervert, Jake! Get out," he roared, his voice thunderous with anger echoed throughout the room. Jake, however, didn't move, his expression dark, as he stood his ground. His expression was stern, his eyes reflecting a mix of pain and anger as he watched them. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and the raw emotions of the moment. The agony Jake felt seeing Chanty and Vasper in such an intimate position was like a knife to his heart. He had chosen this path, to be near Chanty no matter the cost, even if it meant enduring the pain of seeing her with Vasper. He tried to numb himself to the pain, telling himself that the day would come when Chanty would be his. He believed that someday, he would take her away from Vasper. Chanty, overwhelmed with shame, her face flushed with embarrassment, couldn't bring herself to look at Jake. She turned her face away from him. She couldn't bear to look, her embarrassment crushing her. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her body trembling as she clung to Vasper, desperate to disappear. Vasper's rage was barely contained, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists, his protective instincts in overdrive. Without another word, in a flash, Vasper teleported them both to the bedroom, away from Jake's intrusive presence. Their heated passion now replaced by Vasper's seething anger towards Jake. Chanty's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she tried to process what had just happened. She could still feel the burn of Jake's gaze, the humiliating memory of him witnessing their most vulnerable moment. Her face was flushed with humiliation as they quickly stood up, facing each other. "My panties! They're still in the living room." Her voice was a trembling whisper as she confessed. Vasper closed his eyes in frustration, still holding her close, his body trembling with anger, ready to snap Jake's neck without a second thought. He disappeared from Chanty's side, causing her to panic. She rushed to the door, running toward the living room despite not wearing her panties. When she arrived, she saw Vasper holding Jake by the collar with one hand, his face contorted with rage. Jake, however, wore a sardonic smile that only fueled Vasper's fury. Jake's eyes flicked to Chanty, and she felt as if he was undressing her with his gaze, knowing full well she wasn't wearing anything underneath. The tension was palpable as Vasper's grip on Jake tightened. Jake's neck strained, veins bulging, but his gaze never wavered from Chanty. Vasper, unable to hold back any longer, punched Jake in the face with all his strength, sending him crashing through the window, shattering the glass. Chanty screamed at the sheer force of the blow, the cold wind rushing in as she watched Jake disappear from view. The intensity of Vasper's anger stunned her, but just as quickly, Jake reappeared, snow covering his suit, blood dripping from a split in his lip and eyebrow. Yet, despite his injuries, that small, infuriating smile remained on Jake's lips as he focused on Chanty once more. Vasper held Chanty protectively, but she noticed her panties lying on the center table, where Vasper had thrown them earlier. Jake, moving with lightning speed, grabbed the panties before they could react, shocking them both. Their eyes widened as they watched Jake bring the delicate fabric to his nose, inhaling deeply while staring straight into Chanty's eyes. The intensity of the moment was overwhelming, and Chanty covered her mouth with her hands, unable to process what she was seeing. She looked away, unable to meet Jake's gaze in front of Vasper. Rage consumed Vasper, and he lunged at Jake, but Jake vanished, taking Chanty's panties with him. Vasper's momentum caused him to crash into the wall, his frustration boiling over as he turned to Chanty, their eyes locking in a silent exchange of shock and anger. Vasper's jaw tightened, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. He hugged Chanty tightly, his arms wrapping around her protectively as if he could shield her from the world. "I'm taking you to David's," he said firmly, his voice still rough with anger. "Jake, he's dangerous," Vasper muttered, his eyes dark with worry as he held her close. "You can't stay here alone." "Change your clothes," Vasper urged, his voice strained with urgency. Chanty nodded, her hands still trembling as she quickly changed into something more substantial. The fear that had taken root in her heart made every movement feel heavy, as if the air around her had thickened with the weight of what had just transpired. She could barely comprehend the danger that now surrounded them, Jake's actions leaving her shaken to her core. He watched her intently as she changed, his own anger simmering just beneath the surface. The thought of Jake, the psycho, stealing Chanty's panties and smelling them in front of him was driving Vasper mad. His fists were still clenched, knuckles bloodied from his earlier punch, but his rage only grew as he thought about what had just happened. Chanty's hands shook as she dressed, her fear of Jake intensifying with each passing moment. The thought that Jake had taken her panties, had even smelled them, made her feel violated in a way she never imagined. Her body continued to shake, the fear and shame from the encounter overwhelming her. It was the most terrifying and degrading thing she had ever experienced, and the memory of it made her feel sick to her stomach. Jake, the man who once saved her at the river, had become the most perverse and terrifying figure in her life. She couldn't believe the transformation. Vasper was watching her closely, he could see the terror in her eyes, and it only fueled his need to protect her. His eyes dark with anger and lingering shock, the hostility in his gaze a clear indication that Jake had crossed a line. As she finished dressing, Vasper's eyes never left her. He could see the lingering fear in her every move, the way her hands trembled, the way her breath hitched every now and then. His fury toward Jake was barely contained, his mind racing with thoughts of how to keep Chanty safe from the man who had once been Chanty's ally, but had now crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Once again. Vasper pulled her closer, whispering fiercely, "I won't leave you alone with him around," and kiss her gently. His lips lingered for a moment. Then Vasper moved to the broken window. He covered it with a curtain, then again turned to her and pulled her into a tight embrace. "I love you." "I'm sorry for what happened," Vasper whispered, his voice filled with regret. Chanty shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "Don't apologize. If you had left earlier, I would have been the one here when Jake arrived." Vasper thought for a moment, his jaw clenched, then hugged her even tighter, his embrace full of concern, his kisses a promise of protection. "Don't be afraid. I'm here, and I won't let anything happen to you," he reassured her, kissing her repeatedly as Chanty clung to him, her body still trembling. Finally, they're ready to go, though the haunted look in Shanta's eyes told Vasper that she was far from okay. His embrace tightened as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and whispered, "Don't be scared. I'm here, and I won't let anything happen to you." With those words, Vasper teleported them to David's mansion, the one place he believed they could find safety, leaving the chaos behind. But even as they disappeared from the room, the lingering presence of Jake's twisted obsession followed them like a shadow, a threat that loomed just out of sight. When Vasper and Chanty arrived in David's living room, they found David already seated, dressed sharply in a tuxedo. Justin, Marco, and Jacob were also there. David was startled by their sudden appearance. He quickly stood up and approached them with a smile, but he noticed something unusual in Vasper and Shanta's expressions. Justin also observed Shanta's eyes closely. Something was off. Vasper's face was a mask of barely contained fury, his eyes burning with an intensity that spoke of recent conflict, while Shanta's appeared weary and drained. She looked fragile and exhausted, her once vibrant eyes now dim and shadowed. Vasper was the only one wearing a suit, but it was disheveled, the tuxedo wrinkled from the turmoil they had endured. Chanty, on the other hand, was simply dressed in a white t-shirt and tight jeans, but her beauty never faltered. Justin, sensing something was off, approached Vasper and Chanty. Vasper gently guided Chanty to sit on the sofa. David watched them with growing concern, his eyes lingering on Shanta's troubled expression, which now seemed on the verge of tears. Chanty barely responded, her gaze unfocused as she was gently guided by Vasper to sit on the plush sofa. David's brow furrowed as he studied her, noticing the tremble in her hands, the glassy sheen in her eyes. He exchanged a quick, troubled glance with Justin, who had already begun scrutinizing Vasper's grim demeanor. The smile that David had when he first saw them had completely disappeared. "Chanty, what's wrong? Are you still feeling unwell? Have you not recovered from your fever?" Justin asked softly, his tone laced with worry. Jacob's gaze shifted between Vasper and Chanty, while Marco simply observed the two newcomers. "Where's Jake? Why isn't he with you?" David inquired. David's question sliced through the tension like a knife. At the mention of Jake, Shanta's entire body tensed, her breath catching in her throat as a cold shiver ran down her spine, her anxiety flaring up again. Meanwhile, Vasper clenched his jaw, staring intensely at David, with a ferocity that made it clear something terrible had occurred. Vasper's jaw clenched, the tension in Vasper's expression made it clear to everyone that something bad had happened between Jake and Vasper. David stood there, unnerved by Vasper's silent rage, stood motionless, mouth slightly agape, at a loss for words. Jacob let out a hollow laugh, turning away as he already suspected that something had gone terribly wrong during Jake's visit, judging by Vasper and Shanta's reactions. Whatever had happened between Vasper and Jake was serious enough to leave Chanty in the state. "I'm sorry, Chanty," David began, his voice heavy with regret. "It was I who asked Jake for this favor. He was here earlier, but then the vineyard's secretary suddenly called. Laika had shown up there, along with Samara and Prince Raphael. They visited the vineyard." Upon hearing this, both Chanty and Vasper were shocked. Chanty and Vasper exchanged a look of disbelief. The news struck them like a blow. How could Raphael return so quickly? Chanty thought, her mind reeling. They had only just left, and it wasn't even on their schedule to come back so soon, she thought, and now she had to deal with Samara and Raphael on top of everything else. Vasper's face remained unreadable, a mask of controlled emotions, a cold mask of controlled fury. But doubt crept into Shanta's heart. Was Vasper's unexpected trip connected to Samara? The jealousy she had been fighting so hard to suppress flared up once more. She cast a sidelong glance at Vasper, searching his eyes for answers, for any sign that her fears were unfounded. Vasper noticed her scrutiny, his expression shifting ever so slightly as their eyes met. "What?" Vasper asked, his tone sharp. But Chanty did not reply. She averted her gaze, focusing instead on Justin. Her eyes briefly met Jacob's, who had been watching her closely, before she quickly looked away. Unlike Jacob was not aggressive in his feelings for her. He had lost control only once, and since then, he had been careful around her. But Jake frightened her now, especially after what he had done recently in Vasper's home. Shanta's thoughts were interrupted when Marco, his face etched with concern, stepped closer. His eyes searched hers, trying to gauge the depth of her distress. "Did Jake cause more trouble there, Chanty?" Marco asked, breaking the tense silence. Chanty, too embarrassed to share the details of what had just transpired, kept her head down. "I'm sorry, Chanty. I had no other way to inform you about the situation but through Jake. You don't have a phone, no cell phone. Jake was the only one I could ask to relay the message. Laika and Samara requested that the meeting start as soon as possible to discuss the vineyard's damages and the upcoming projects," David explained further. Chanty hesitated, ashamed to speak of what had recently happened between her and Jake. Vasper stepped closer to her, gently lifting her to her feet and pulling her into a protective embrace. David and the others watched silently as Chanty clung tightly to Vasper, seeking comfort. Vasper stepped closer to Chanty, his expression softening as he gently lifted her chin to meet his gaze. His other hand rested protectively on her waist. "Do you have something you want to tell me?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with an unspoken urgency. Chanty hesitated, the words she longed to say caught in her throat. But Vasper wouldn't let her off so easily. He sensed her turmoil and was determined to uncover what was troubling her. Chanty finally found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Are you meeting Samara?" she asked bluntly, her jealousy now surfacing openly. David, who had been pretending not to listen, subtly turned away, as did Justin and Marco. The tension in the room thickened, everyone acutely aware of the underlying emotions at play. Vasper, surprisingly, was amused by her question. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "No," he chuckled softly. "We're not meeting today. But if you come to the vineyard with me, it's possible we might run into each other. But you know," he added, his voice lowering to an intimate whisper meant only for Shanta's ears, "there's no need to worry about her. You know where my heart truly lies. Don't let Samara add to your burdens. You already have enough on your shoulders." Vasper's words were meant to soothe, but they only heightened the intensity of the moment. He leaned in, pressing his lips to her in a passionate kiss, conveying all the reassurance she needed. Their lips lingered, the kiss deepening as if they were the only two people in the world. Justin and Marco exchanged awkward glances, feeling like intruders on a private moment. David, watching from the sidelines, let out a silent sigh. Love was such a complicated thing, hard to define, impossible to control. It had changed Jake, it had changed Vasper, and now it threatened to upend everything between Vasper and Samara. Jacob, however, refused to look, turning his gaze instead to the still-broken window. David's house, which had been damaged, was still not fully repaired. "Vasper," David said, breaking the moment, his tone serious. "The elves of Alexander were here again last night," David said seriously, that left no room for misinterpretation. His eyes locking with Vasper. And Vasper returned the gaze, his expression a deadly serious mask, his lips pressed tightly together as he restrained his emotions. "What did Jake do this time, Chanty?" David asked, his brow furrowing in curiosity about what new trouble Jake might have caused. "He promised not to create any problems. Even though he's no longer part of our group, he volunteered to help, as long as it involved you, Chanty. He said he wouldn't cause any trouble unless provoked. I trusted him because Jake has always kept his word," David added. "But from your reactions, it seems something went wrong. All I asked him to do was to inform you about the vineyard. And, to be honest, I had him deal with Laika and Samara temporarily because I had to handle something up north. There was some disturbance there. Several young women have gone missing." David's voice trailed off as he locked eyes with Vasper, conveying a silent message that Vasper understood perfectly. The look on Vasper's face was now deadly serious, which caught Shanta's attention. She looked between David and Vasper, then at the others, sensing that they were all communicating silently with their eyes. Gabriel and Louis are in the south, investigating some incidents there. There's trouble brewing in the Middle East, involving violations of the treaty between humans and the inner world. It seems they're starting to stir things up again. Tomorrow, Marco, Justin, and Jacob will head west. Laika's precious stone mines have been discovered to involve illegal activities, which are prohibited by law here in the outer world, David continued, his voice steady despite the tension. Upon hearing this, Vasper stopped looking at David, already aware of Laika's illegal activities in her mines. Forgive us in advance, Vasper, for whatever we might have to do there. We need to conduct our investigation on site, as many of our people have gone missing. It's highly suspicious that they've vanished without a trace, their bodies never found. Their families are still searching for them, but Laika has kept the news completely under wraps, not a single word has leaked out, Justin said, his gaze fixed on Vasper. Vasper's thoughts turned to Chanty, who looked puzzled by the discussion. She had no idea what they were talking about. Who looked confused and troubled by the conversation. The weight of their words lost on her. Why don't you go to your room and relax? Vasper suggested softly, placing his hand on her waist and looking into her eyes. His voice was full of concern, and Chanty nodded slowly. I'll come back as soon as I've finished my business, Vasper whispered to her, just above a whisper. Jacob watched their gentle interaction, finding it hard to believe the change in Vasper. It was a stark contrast to his previous life before Chanty came into it. Jacob knew all too well about Vasper's past. It was his job to monitor Vasper's activities, to keep an eye out for any illegal dealings and get ahead of Vasper when possible. He never imagined they would reach a point where they could converse without hostility. Chanty seemed like a miracle in their lives. Vasper's life before Chanty was filled with women by his side, wild parties, racing, and involvement in illegal activities. Jacob still couldn't understand why Chanty chose to love Vasper. Chanty, innocent and unparalleled in beauty, seemed like an angel in her purity, yet her beauty was so radiant and tempting that it was almost devilish. Even at her young age, Chanty's figure was that of a fully blossomed woman, like a perfectly ripe fruit, a forbidden temptation for men. It was no wonder that Jake and Vasper had both gone mad for her, and Jacob too. But unlike them, Jacob's love for Chanty, though known to all, was selfless. He only wanted her happiness, even if it meant she chose Vasper, though it pained him deeply. Jake, on the other hand, was different. His love for Chanty was possessive and aggressive, much like Vasper's. David, may I be excused from the meeting? Chanty asked, turning to face David. I'll check on things once I get there, Chanty. I'll let you know. I have to leave soon, they're already waiting there, David replied. Just then, Lorena emerged from the kitchen, her face lighting up at the sight of Chanty. Miss Chanty. I'm so glad you're here. Perfect timing, we've just finished cooking. Let's eat. Samuel and Laura are already setting the table, Lorena said cheerfully. Chanty smiled back at Lorena, then turned to Vasper. Can you stay for lunch? So we can eat together? She asked sweetly, her eyes pleading with Vasper. Vasper smiled but shook his head. Maybe for dinner. I'm not hungry yet. I'd rather finish my tasks for today, Vasper replied quietly, but loud enough for David to hear. Justin and Jacob returned to the sofa, sitting down as Vasper turned to David. David, please keep Jake away from Chanty, Vasper said seriously, and all eyes turned to him, including Chanty's and Lorena's. David nodded solemnly. Justin and Marco will stay here. I'll head to the vineyards now. I might not return until tomorrow, as I have to go straight to my office. I have a lot to take care of today, Chanty. We'll see each other tomorrow. Justin and Marco will keep an eye on you, David added. As for Jake, I don't know where he went, but he tends to appear out of nowhere. I no longer have control over his activities, David said, looking at Vasper, who remained tight-lipped. Don't worry, Chanty, we're here, Marco said, trying to reassure her. Jake wouldn't dare do anything bad to you with us around. He'd be too embarrassed in front of us. Besides, it's only Vasper he disrespects. Everyone knew that Jake had no respect for Vasper, which only made Vasper's anger simmer further, though he kept it in check. Jake might still have some decency left, he added, trying to lighten the mood. As Marco spoke, tension simmered among everyone present. The truth was, Jake really had no respect for Vasper, and it showed in his behavior. Vasper's anger was boiling inside him, but he forced himself to stay composed. Chanty, on the other hand, was deeply concerned and felt a sense of shame over what had happened between them. However, she had no intention of revealing what Jake had done. She was too embarrassed. How could she confess that Jake had stolen and taken her underwear? "Go, Vasper," Chanty said as she released his hand, allowing him to leave. She forced a smile to ease the worry she knew Vasper was feeling for her. Vasper looked at her, then gently kissed her lips while holding her tightly. His lips lingered on hers for a long moment. "I'll be back later," he whispered. Chanty nodded in response, and just like that, Vasper disappeared. After Vasper left, David retrieved his black bag and told Chanty that he was going as well. David exited the house, and Chanty watched as his black car drove out through the broken gate, which still hadn't been repaired. Once David was out of sight, Chanty headed to her room, leaving Justin and the others playing cards in the living room. Jacob quietly followed her with his eyes, feeling a deep sense of pity for Chanty. He understood the heavy burden she was carrying. Meanwhile, Justin and Marco exchanged glances at Jacob. "You two, we're keeping an eye on you, not just Jake," Justin said. Though he was joking, there was truth in his words. They were all vigilant, especially around Chanty. They knew Jacob had lost control over Chanty before, and they wouldn't allow that to happen again. Jacob simply looked at Justin and Marco. He couldn't blame them for watching him as well. Lorena brought some food from the kitchen to Chanty's room. After Chanty finished eating, Lorena cleared the dishes and left her alone in her room. Vasper teleported to his mansion, materializing with a quiet intensity in his dimly lit bedroom. The air around him was thick with tension as he moved with purpose, his thoughts consumed by a single, burning image, Jake. His rage had simmered long enough, now bubbling over into an uncontrollable fury. Every fiber of his being seethed with anger as he marched toward the shower, now naked. The water cascaded over him like a torrent, but it did nothing to quench the heat that radiated from his body. His anger toward Jake had reached its boiling point, it had surpassed its limit. Even under the shower, his body felt unbearably hot from his rage. Whirling with memories he wished he could erase. He couldn't forget the image of Jake staring at Chanty's exposed legs, the way Jake had stared at Chanty's exposed legs, his gaze lingering as if he had every right to possess her. He couldn't forget the moment Jake had brazenly sniffed Chanty's underwear, all while locking eyes with her as he smiled. The image was seared into Vasper's mind, a constant reminder of the disrespect, the violation of something sacred. His eyes filled with desire, as if he could devour her. Vasper's fury was volcanic, consuming him as he clenched his fists, the veins in his arms pulsing with the intensity of his emotions. At that moment, Vasper had an overwhelming urge to gouge Jake's eyes out. His body trembled with fury, his muscles tensed, and in an explosive release of rage, suddenly, he punched the bathroom wall. The force was so tremendous that the tiles shattered upon impact, leaving a gaping hole where his fist had struck. Blood trickled from his knuckles, running down the wall in thin rivulets, mingling with the water as it spiraled down the drain. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to regain control, his eyes squeezing shut as he forced himself to calm down. Forcing himself to relax, fearing that more damage would be done to his bathroom wall. As he concentrated, the wound on his knuckles healed, the wound began to close, the torn skin knitting back together until there was no trace of the injury. But the anger remained, burning fiercely in his chest. He couldn't erase the terror he had seen in Chanty's eyes, the way her gaze had pleaded with him for protection. His protective instincts toward her grew stronger, to the point where he wished he could stay by her side forever. He wouldn't let Jake's actions go unpunished. Vasper vowed that he would make him pay. Determined, he finished his shower, his movements quick and precise, dried his hair with a towel, and selected his clothes from the closet. His mind already planning his next move. He selected a tuxedo, the dark fabric clinging to his powerful frame as he dressed with methodical efficiency. His reflection in the mirror was deadly serious. He's literally impossibly handsome, dangerously attractive. His powerful stature is undeniable. His eyes hard and cold. He had to end this now, and the threat that Jake posed to his world, to Chanty. Before heading to his meeting with a business partner at a restaurant. Before leaving, Vasper reached for a watch from his collection, each one carefully displayed in a sliding glass drawer. He rarely wore a watch unless he planned to finish someone off with his own hands. His fingers hovered over the options before settling on one with a red diamond in the center, a symbol of the same fierce love he had for Chanty, much like the red diamond ring he had given her. His expression remained stoic, a mask of the man he had once been, the man who had lived a life steeped in darkness before Chanty had brought light into his world. From his bedroom, Vasper teleported to the large vault hidden within his mansion, a secret chamber adjacent to the expansive library. The vault was a fortress, housing an arsenal of weapons, some forged for mortals, others imbued with powers meant for immortals. He approached the shelves with a focused intensity, his eyes scanning the weapons until they landed on the one he needed. There was one important item he needed to bring, the suspended bracelet. This was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It was a device of immense power, capable of stripping even the strongest beings of their abilities. Whoever wore this bracelet would lose their powers if they were powerful. It was used in the inner world as a punishment for those who broke their laws, a sentence for the guilty. It was a punishment reserved for the most egregious offenders, a way to render them powerless for a time. But this particular bracelet was unique. It was only effective for 3 days, just long enough for Vasper to do what needed to be done. His mind was already set. Jake wouldn't survive 24 hours. He slipped the bracelet into his pocket, feeling the weight of it, the promise of what it would do. After 3 days, it would automatically fall off or disappear. There were other suspended bracelets with longer durations, but the one in his possession was only effective for 3 days. That was enough for him. He was determined that his target wouldn't last even 24 hours. And that target was Jake. He placed the bracelet in his pants pocket. Obtaining a suspended bracelet was no easy feat. It could only be acquired from a higher rank in the inner world. Vasper had one because he was Alexander Mondragon's son, but even Leica hadn't been able to obtain one. Not all of Alexander Mondragon's children possessed such an artifact. Vasper was one of the lucky few. But luck had little to do with it. It was a gift from a woman, the wife of a high-ranking official in the inner world, Victoria, second only to Alexander Mondragon. The woman had desired Vasper with a fervor that bordered on obsession, willing to trade anything for just one night with him. Even if just for one night. At that time, the suspended bracelet was the only thing missing from his collection, and Victoria offered for it in exchange for one night of pleasure with Vasper in bed. Vasper chuckled bitterly as the memory surfaced, a sour grin twisting his lips. He remembered how wild Victoria had been in bed, how they had both lost themselves in a frenzy of lust and betrayal. The memory now filled him with disgust, a bitter taste left in his mouth along with memories of countless other women who had crossed his path. But those days were long gone, a part of Vasper's life he had no desire to revisit, not since Chanty had come into his life. But all those experiences were now just a part of Vasper's past, something he never wanted to repeat since Chanty entered his life. There was no other woman he desired in his life but Chanty. His body craved no one else but Chanty, the only one his heart desired. He would do anything to keep her, to make sure she never left his side. He didn't want to lose her, and he was willing to trade everything he owned for her. He would give up everything he had for her. He would do anything for her. And Jake, a threat to his life, had caused immense turmoil within him. The threat to his happiness was a problem that needed to be eliminated. His intense jealousy of Jake and anyone else who wanted to take Chanty from him was unforgivable. Anyone else who dared to lay claim to Chanty was something he could never forgive. Not even his father, Alexander Mondragon. He couldn't forget Chanty's dream about Alexander Mondragon. Even though it was just a dream, Vasper still felt jealous. Not just any ordinary jealousy, but because he knew that what he saw in Chanty's dream was exactly what Alexander did to his victims who were virgins. If the woman wasn't a virgin, Alexander Mondragon would simply have sex with her as he pleased. He would use her and discard her at his whim. But with virgins, it was different, and Vasper would never allow that to happen to Chanty. Vasper left the vault room, his steps echoing through the halls, and Khalid met him in the living room. Khalid bowed in respect. Vasper acknowledged him with a curt nod, and he signaled with his hand that it was okay. Without another word, Vasper headed straight outside to the garage, his movements fluid and precise. He surveyed his collection of cars, finally settling on the red sports car. His choice was deliberate, every move calculated. He started the engine, the roar of it resonating with his own simmering anger. As he approached the massive gate, it opened automatically, recognizing the power of the man behind the wheel. The car sped through, the gate closing swiftly behind him as he disappeared. Inside the mansion, Khalid and the staff remained, accustomed to their master's rare appearances, their expressions unchanging as they went about their duties. They understood that Vasper's world was one of secrets and shadows, a world they would never fully comprehend. Vasper arrived at his destination, a luxurious 5-star restaurant. The dim underground parking area echoed with the soft hum of his car's engine as he carefully maneuvered into a secluded spot, just outside the reach of the surveillance cameras. Inside the car, his expression was a steely mask of determination. He glanced at his wristwatch. There was still more than an hour before his scheduled meeting with his business partner in the restaurant. Time was on his side, enough time to execute the plan he had meticulously crafted for Jake. Without a sound, Vasper vanished from the car, and reappearing inside Jake's mansion, materializing in the grand living room. His body and eyes alert, his eyes sharp and predatory, like a lion on the hunt for its prey. His steps were slow and silent, his stance powerful and dangerous. Vasper's aura was a potent mix of power and danger, an intoxicating allure that could seduce women while striking fear into the hearts of men. He ensured that no one could detect him, not even his presence, as he cloaked himself with an invisible shield. From his vantage point, he could see the breathtaking view of the turquoise sea below, which triggered a memory of the time he had brought Chanty to this very spot, the same time he clashed with Jake and Jacob, moments of conflict and passion that were etched into his mind. His mind drifted to the beach below, where Chanty often practiced her sword skills with Lewis, her form graceful and deadly, like a warrior goddess. The mansion was eerily quiet, the only sound being the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shore, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. The sleek, modern architecture of Jake's mansion caught his eye, a style that resonated with his vision for the beach house he planned to share with Chanty. Yet, admiration was tinged with venom. This place belonged to his enemy. He reached the dining area, surveying the surroundings. Vasper's senses were heightened, searching for any trace of Jake's presence. But there was nothing. He couldn't sense Jake's presence, not even the faintest trace of his power. Jake must not have returned home yet. Vasper's hand slipped into his pocket, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the bracelet he intended to place on Jake. Then, in a flash, he teleported to the beach. The water was impossibly clear. As he gazed at the crystal-clear water, his eyes were drawn to a large, shattered rock. A reminder of the night Jake had hidden behind it. Memories of Chanty flashed through his mind, how Jake had hidden behind that very rock, his eyes glued to Chanty watching her as she swam half-naked in the sea. It was night, the moon glowing brightly in the sky. Jake had remained unseen by Chanty, concealed in the rock's shadow. The rock now had a large gaping hole, broken and cracked. Now, stood as a monument to that violation. A storm of rage surged within him. Overcome with fury at the memory, Vasper punched the rock with all his strength, shattering it further, sending chunks of stone crashing to the sand. He shattered the rock further, blood dripped from his knuckles, but the pain was drowned out by his deep, ragged breaths as he stared at his bleeding fist. His eyes burned with rage. He didn't feel the pain despite the blood flowing from his knuckles. In his mind, it wasn't the rock he had struck, but Jake, and the blood belonged to Jake. The pain was insignificant, the blood could have been Jake's for all he cared. Labored breathing of a man consumed by anger. His eyes blazed with a feral intensity as he stared at his bloodied fist. Closing his eyes, Vasper concentrated. He willed the wound on his knuckles to heal. The flesh knitting together under the force of his willpower. When he lifted his hand from the rock, the wound had closed, the injury was gone, though blood still stained his skin. He walked to the water's edge, dipping his hand into the cool sea, washed his bloodied hand, watching as the blood washed away, leaving his skin clean. Once his hand was clean, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, drying his hand while his eyes scanned the beach, every sense alert. Then he noticed it, a sleek, modern yacht anchored near the distant rocks. Intrigued, Vasper teleported aboard. The yacht was brand new, its pristine condition giving it away. The yacht was immaculate, evident in every polished surface. Vasper was certain it belonged to Jake. From the upper deck, he could see Jake's grand mansion, proudly perched on the large rocky island. Vasper explored the yacht. Vasper moved through, descending to the lower deck where he found a small, opulent living room and a bed. But what caught his eye, made his blood boil, was the sight of Chanty's white lingerie, carefully laid out on the pillow. Jake had taken it. The sight of it made Vasper's heart pound with anger. His hand trembled with rage as he picked up the delicate fabric. The thought of Jake touching Chanty's intimate garment filled him with a burning anger. How dare he? Did Jake use this as his pillow? Vasper's mind raced with images he wished he could erase. Vasper couldn't bear to imagine what Jake might have done with Chanty's intimate garment, his hands trembling with rage. Bringing the fabric to his face, Vasper inhaled deeply, the scent of Chanty's body still clinging to the cloth. The scent ignited a fire within him, an unbearable heat, yet even in this, he felt a possessive rage. This scent, this intimacy was his, and his alone. But even the intoxicating fragrance was something he refused to share with anyone, especially not with Jake. He tucked the panties into his pocket and teleported back to Jake's mansion. Vasper searched the mansion thoroughly. He prowled through, searching every room, but found no sign of Jake. Checking his wristwatch, he muttered, "It's almost time," and teleported back to his sports car parked at the restaurant. Sitting in the driver's seat, he retrieved Chanty's white lingerie from his pocket. A mischievous smile played on his lips as he imagined how he undressed her in front of him, her body revealed entirely to his hungry gaze. The thought made his blood race with desire. He couldn't wait to return to her. After inhaling the scent of the lingerie one last time, he tucked it back into his pocket. Stepping out of the car, he adjusted his necktie, walking powerfully towards the restaurant entrance. The guard opened the door for him, giving him a respectful bow, recognizing the power in Vasper's presence. Vasper walked straight inside. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, all eyes turned towards him, drawn by an irresistible force. The eyes of the diners followed him, their gazes drawn to him as if he were a magnet. The women's eyes sparkled with admiration, lips curving into secretive smiles and secret thrills, while the men watched him with a mix of insecurity and envy. The women's gazes trailed him from head to toe, taking in every detail of his striking appearance. Vasper could hear the whispers of the women talking about him, words he had heard countless times before. Many of them dreamed of tasting his prowess in bed, even just once. This was the life he was accustomed to, and those words no longer affected him. It was a normal occurrence, something that no longer fazed him, a part of his life that had lost its power over him. He walked to his table, marked with a reservation in his name. Although there were only supposed to be 2 of them for the meeting, the table was large, almost fit for 6 people. He paid it no mind. A waiter approached, attending to him with a level of respect that bordered on reverence. As he waited for his business partner, he checked the time, 20 minutes left. Leaning back in his chair, one hand in his pocket holding Chanty's underwear, Vasper felt the heat rising in his body again, his impatience growing. He couldn't wait to go home and see Chanty. The patrons in the restaurant couldn't stop glancing at him. They continued to steal glances at him, their curiosity evident. Vasper picked up the menu, scanning it to decide what to order. Scanning for something special to bring home for Chanty. He called the waiter over and discussed his takeout order, which the waiter noted with utmost respect. As the waiter left, Vasper glanced at his watch again. Almost time. His thoughts returned to Jake, who had been lucky today to escape his wrath. "You're lucky today, Jake," Vasper muttered under his breath, his voice laced with menace. "If I had caught you, you wouldn't have lived to see another day." His fists clenched tightly, resting against his mouth, elbows propped on the table as he stared at the restaurant entrance, waiting. While Vasper waited for Henry Hudson, his business partner, for their scheduled meeting, he couldn't help but notice a growing commotion outside the restaurant. The restaurant had glass walls, allowing him a clear view from where he sat. Offered an unobstructed view of the bustling street beyond. His attention was drawn to a crowd gathering on the sidewalk, their curiosity palpable. The surroundings had become increasingly busy, and he spotted a media van pulling up. Van screeched to a halt, and within seconds, reporters swarmed out, their cameras and microphones aimed squarely at the restaurant's entrance. Reporters stepped out and began setting up their positions outside, their cameras focused intently on the restaurant's interior. Curiosity piqued, Vasper wondered what the media was covering. The scene was alive with anticipation, as if the city itself held its breath. His curiosity sharpened, his mind racing to decipher what event had stirred such fervent interest. He took a casual glance around the restaurant's interior. Inside, everything was serene and peaceful, remained a sanctuary of calm, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing outside. The diners within seemed mostly indifferent, though some shared curious looks. The soft clink of silverware and the murmur of quiet conversations filled the air, with diners mostly oblivious to the drama unfolding beyond the glass walls. Yet, a few exchanged curious glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere. As Vasper took a measured sip of the rich wine the waiter had served him, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The minutes ticked by, his partner's tardiness gnawing at his nerves. His eyes drifted once more to the scene outside, the tension within him tightening like a vice. His partner was already 2 minutes late, yet he hadn't arrived. When his food was eventually served due to his hunger, Vasper glanced outside once more while sipping his wine. That's when he saw them, a group of men clad in black, unmistakably security personnel. Vasper's expression grew hardened, serious, confusion registering in his mind as his brows knitting together as confusion and suspicion warred within him. His gaze fixed on the arrival of the security team. His gaze followed the security detail until it locked onto the figures they were escorting. And then he saw them, Samara, Prince Raphael, and Laika, accompanied by Henry Hudson. The media cameras were now all focused on them as they made their way toward the restaurant entrance. Vasper's lips tightened into a thin line, his eyes darkening as he watched the people he least wanted to see enter the restaurant. A surge of anger flared within him. Vasper's jaw tightened, his mood darkening like a storm on the horizon. How had Laika discovered his meeting with Hudson? And why, of all people, had she brought Samara along? Just as Vasper was about to stand and leave, the waiter arrived with his order. He looked at the food with disdain, his appetite vanishing as quickly as his anger simmered beneath the surface, barely contained. His appetite was a casualty of the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. The sight of the food only deepened his scowl. The restaurant's tranquil ambience shattered as Samara entered, her presence commanding every gaze. All eyes in the restaurant turned toward the entrance as Samara, wearing a seductive black dress with a deep cleavage and a high slit, she moved with the grace of a predator. Her smile was wide, triumphant, and utterly fixated on Vasper. The allure of her beauty was undeniable, drawing the eyes of every patron, but Vasper's stare was cold, his lips pressed into a thin line. Her beauty and the alluring shape of her body were on full display, drawing every gaze. Samara's sweet smile was directed squarely at Vasper, while Prince Raphael and Laika followed closely behind, each playing their part with perfect professionalism. Despite everything, Laika managed to feign innocence, as if she hadn't done anything wrong to Chanty. But Vasper's focus was on Henry Hudson, whose serious expression betrayed a foul mood. Samara was the first to reach the table. Her grin widened as she exclaimed, "Vasper, I miss you already." Without hesitation, she slid into the seat beside him, leaning in to kiss his lips and wrap her arms around his neck. Vasper's reaction was immediate. He gently but firmly. He subtly removed Samara's hands from his neck, his voice a low, dangerous whisper meant for her ears alone. "Samara, can you behave?" But Samara, undeterred, simply ignored him, her behavior unashamed despite the many eyes on them, ever the provocateur, ignored his warning, her behavior shamelessly bold even under the watchful eyes of the entire restaurant. Raphael approached next, extending his hand for a handshake and a show of politeness. Followed by Hudson, whose handshake felt like a formality. While Laika took the seat next to Samara, her presence adding to the tension crackling in the air. The interaction was strictly professional, yet Vasper sensed the undercurrent of tension, professional on the surface, but beneath it, Vasper sensed an undercurrent of manipulation. Hudson mentioned that Laika had called him regarding an important matter concerning Vasper's plans for the company. Hudson was keen on investing in the venture shared by Laika and Vasper, but Vasper had intended for this meeting to be private between him and Hudson. It was clear Laika had anticipated Vasper's intentions and acted preemptively, but his plans remained unchanged. He wouldn't allow her to derail his plans. As the attention of everyone inside, and even outside the restaurant, honed in on their table, Vasper's patience thinned. His gaze flicked to the cameras still trained on them, and he turned to Laika, his voice sharp with irritation. "Laika, what's with the cameras outside? Why is the media here? Are they following Samara and Raphael, the royal siblings?" Raphael's expression soured, his irritation evident as he shot a reproachful glance at Samara. "I told you, Samara, we should have kept our return a secret to avoid all this fuss. But now look at this mess. Why did you allow the media to tag along?" He sounded exasperated by the chaos caused by the flashing cameras. His tone was edged with frustration, the chaos of the flashing cameras grating on his nerves. Laika, however, only smiled, a gesture as inscrutable as it was infuriating. "Mr. Hudson," Vasper interjected abruptly, "let's reschedule our discussion for another time, when it's just the two of us." His decision firm and unyielding, he stood up, intending to leave. His resolve evident in the stiff set of his shoulders. Hudson looked uncomfortable, clearly taken aback by the sudden change in plans, but Laika's sarcastic smile suggested she had expected this all along. Just as Vasper was about to walk away, Samara grabbed his arm, pulling him back down. "Vasper, we just arrived. You haven't even touched your food. Can't you at least stay and eat?" "You didn't even ask how I've been," Samara said, pouting like a child in front of everyone. Her voice a blend of childish petulance and coy manipulation. Raphael chuckled at his sister's antics, while Hudson smiled awkwardly. Vasper seethed with anger at Samara's persistence, the barely restrained fury flickering in his eyes. A waiter approached, handing out menus to each of them, with impeccable timing. Samara, relentless, tugged at Vasper's arm once more, forcing him back into his seat. Reluctantly, not wanting to cause a scene in the restaurant, Vasper conceded, enduring the next few minutes, in silent agony as he faced the very people he least wanted to see. They ordered wine as they waited for their food, and Vasper felt compelled to join them, and though he joined them out of obligation, his appetite had long since vanished. When everyone's orders finally arrived, they ate in a strained silence, punctuated only by Samara's calculated provocations. Samara, ever the provocateur, subtly placed her hand on the inner part of Vasper's thigh while she spoke, a move that infuriated him. Her touch traveling dangerously close to a place that made his blood boil. The restaurant's minimalist table design offered little in the way of discretion, visible even from the outside. Vasper discreetly tried to remove Samara's hand, which was dangerously close to an inappropriate area. Laika watched with a knowing smile, fully aware of what Samara was doing to Vasper. Her eyes glinted with mischief as she monitored the media outside, the puppet master pulling the strings. She informed Vasper, "We just came from the vineyards, met with David and Jake," she said casually, her tone laced with hidden meaning. "That explains why Jake wasn't at his mansion, he was at Chanty's vineyard. Tomorrow's final meeting is crucial, and Chanty must be there." Laika's mention of Chanty's name made Raphael smile, a reaction that did not go unnoticed by Vasper. His anger, already at the boiling point, threatened to erupt as he glared at the prince. "Didn't we already inform David earlier? That Chanty needs to be there too? Do we still need to inform Vasper? What does Vasper have to do with the vineyard?" Samara asked with a knowing smile, her gaze fixed meaningfully on Raphael. Vasper noticed the irritating expressions on the faces of the two siblings and didn't appreciate Samara's teasing about Chanty. This only fueled the hidden anger Vasper harbored towards the prince. Samara knew that Prince Raphael was eager to see Chanty. "No, Samara, you misunderstood. I only mentioned it. You already know, Prince Raphael wants to see Chanty, Laika added teasingly to Raphael, though her real intention was to provoke Vasper. Raphael just looked at Laika and Samara with a professional smile, as if it were a normal reaction, but deep in his heart, it was Chanty he longed for, which was the reason he accompanied Samara back. Raphael continued eating with a smile on his lips, while Vasper simmered with anger towards everyone except Hudson. Hudson, for his part, ignored the conversation that didn't concern him. He felt more embarrassed for Vasper, having given in so easily to Laika's insistence on attending their meetup. He hadn't hesitated because he knew Vasper and Laika were siblings, assuming Vasper was okay with it, but it was clear from Vasper's expression the moment they arrived at the restaurant that he was disappointed in him. "Doesn't Chanty already have a boyfriend?" Samara asked Laika, her curiosity piqued. Both Vasper and Raphael suddenly looked at Laika and Samara. "Imagine being given $1 million red diamond by your boyfriend? He's not just an ordinary citizen. Of course, with Chanty's beauty, she's worth it," Samara said, smiling as she looked at Vasper. She then showed off the ring she was wearing, the diamond ring Vasper had given her on her 19th birthday. Vasper realized then that he had once given Samara a diamond ring too, but it didn't matter much to him since he had given similar rings to many women who had passed through his life. But the red diamond was different. That ring was unique and special to him, which was why he had given it to Chanty. Laika smiled sardonically, laughing at the change in Vasper's expression. "A boyfriend, not a husband," Prince Raphael added bluntly. "In the future, many things can happen. It's possible that I might be her husband someday." The prince's words were direct, causing Samara and Laika to laugh. But Laika's eyes were on Vasper, thoroughly enjoying his discomfort. Laika noticed how Vasper's hand had been clenched in a tight fist for a while now, his jaw tense, yet he maintained his composure professionally. In Vasper's mind, he had been wanting to punch Raphael for a while. And then the atmosphere shifted dramatically when Samara suddenly became serious. "We were deeply saddened by the fire at the vineyards." "Such a loss," Samara added, her tone filled with sympathy for Chanty, mirrored by Raphael's expression. But when Vasper looked at Laika, she simply raised an eyebrow at him, her demeanor challenging, told a different story, one that made his blood run hot with barely contained fury. While Vasper felt as if he was about to explode with rage. The whispers among the surrounding diners grew louder as they recognized Vasper and Samara, their fascination only heightening his irritation. After forcing himself to finish his meal, Vasper took out his black card and handed it to the waiter, desperate to escape. All he wanted was to leave this nightmare behind. But Samara pleaded with him, asking him to stay a little longer. "Vasper, please, just stay a bit more. I miss you," her voice, saccharine and cloying, sent a shiver down his spine, though not in the way she intended. "I have something important to take care of." "I can't be late," Vasper replied firmly, his tone clipped and final as he stood, ready to leave. Standing up, clearly ready to leave. He waited for his card to be returned, eager to escape the situation. "All right, we'll meet again next time, Mr. Hudson," Vasper said, taking the card from the waiter, who thanked him politely, with a polite nod, but Vasper barely acknowledged it, his mind already on the exit. Without a moment's hesitation, Vasper headed toward the restaurant's exit, his strides long and purposeful as he made his way to his car. He could feel the eyes of everyone, followed him, as did the cameras outside, their lenses capturing his every move. Fury simmered within him as he glared at the media personnel. Their relentless intrusion like salt on a raw wound. He reached his sports car, intending to unlock it, but just as he was about to do so, he heard Samara call out to him. "Vasper," she shouted, her tone laced with desperation. He paused, turned to look, just enough to acknowledge her presence, but in the next instant ignored her, slipping into his car and starting the engine without a second glance. The passenger side door flung open with a sudden force, and before Vasper could react, Samara climbed inside, her expression cold and determined. She settled beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, exuding an air of defiance. Her piercing eyes bore into Vasper, who scowled in return, his patience fraying by the second. "Get out, Samara. I have somewhere important to be, and I don't have time for your nonsense." Vasper's voice was a venomous mix of coldness and irritation, each word as sharp as a dagger as he glared at her. A dark storm brewed behind his eyes, his mood blackened by her unyielding presence. Samara's stubbornness only fanned the flames of his growing fury. But Samara didn't flinch. Her resolve was ironclad. "Take me with you. I don't care where you're going, but I'm coming along." Her voice was steely as she defiantly fastened her seatbelt, settling into the seat with an air of finality that dared him to challenge her. Vasper's anger flared like a wildfire. His grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face twitched with the effort of keeping his composure. "Get out now, Samara. Don't push me." "I'm not playing games," he hissed through gritted teeth, his voice low and menacing, a clear warning that she was dangerously close to pushing him over the edge. But Samara was undeterred. She unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned in closer, her eyes blazing with fierce determination. "What's wrong with you, Vasper? Are you even a man? What kind of man are you?" Her words were a sharp jab, each one a needle to his pride. She shoved him in the chest, her frustration boiling over. "You didn't even ask how I've been. Not once did you check on me, where I'm staying, how I'm doing, nothing. I've been feeding myself with thoughts of you, obsessing over you, Vasper. I miss you so much." Her voice cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. "I've missed you so terribly," she added, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "And it hurts that you don't even care." Samara's frustration spiraled into desperation as she slapped Vasper's chest repeatedly, her emotions spilling out uncontrollably. Inside the car, she was a whirlwind of despair, her cries echoing in the small space, while Vasper stared at her in disbelief, his mind reeling from the intensity of her outburst. He couldn't believe how difficult she was to reason with. For a brief moment, Vasper considered using his teleportation power to take her back to her country and leave her there, far from this madness. But the thought of causing a public scene, with the media already hot on Samara's heels, stayed his hand. A quick glance outside confirmed his fears. The cameras were already trained on his car, capturing every second of this chaotic encounter. His frustration deepened as he realized that instead of keeping a low profile, he was now the unwilling star of a public spectacle. "Get out, Samara. Now." Vasper's voice was laced with a deadly warning, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. But Samara, unfazed, shot back, "I'm not leaving. I'm going with you, wherever you go." She rebuckled her seatbelt with a finality that only fueled his rage. Vasper, now fuming, reached over and unbuckled her seatbelt in one swift, angry motion. But before he could push her out, Samara seized the moment, leaning in and pressing her lips against his. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her body pressing against his in the driver's seat. Vasper's mind raced, trying to resist, trying to push her away, but Samara was relentless. She climbed onto his lap, straddling him with a desperation that bordered on madness, her actions fueled by a dangerous mix of longing and aggression. "Vasper, I miss you so much. I want you," she whispered against his lips, her voice dripping with desire as the buttons of her blouse came undone, revealing her bra and bare skin. Vasper grabbed her shoulders, pushing her back, trying to get her off him, but Samara refused to budge. "Get off. Samara, have you no shame? You're a princess, and this is how you behave. What's next? Are you going to force yourself on me? Is this how you want to live your life? I have no love for you, Samara. We've been over for a long time. Accept the truth and move on for your own sake. I don't love you, not even a little. Please, just leave." Vasper's voice was firm, each word a final nail in the coffin of their doomed relationship. Samara's response was swift and brutal. She slapped him hard across the face, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "You have no heart, Vasper. Why are you like this? How could you change so suddenly? What did I do wrong? My whole world revolves around you, and you just changed, just like that. I can't live without you," she screamed, slapping him again and again, her anger and pain exploding in a torrent of blows. Vasper's cheeks turned red from the repeated slaps, but he remained silent, allowing her to vent her fury, knowing she needed to release her emotions. Samara's sobs grew louder, her voice breaking with each anguished declaration of love. "I love you, Vasper. I love you, you bastard," she cried out, her voice raw with emotion. She repeated the words over and over, each one a dagger to his heart, her voice cracking under the weight of her despair. From the outside, Vasper's car appeared to be shaking, leading onlookers to misinterpret the scene within. Some people laughed, their minds jumping to the wrong conclusion, while others simply watched, captivated by the drama unfolding before them. After what felt like an eternity, Samara's crying subsided. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, but even in her disarray, her beauty remained striking. Vasper lay silently in his seat, unmoving, his face turned away, his cheeks still stinging from her slaps, a small scratch from her nails tracing a faint line of blood. Then, Samara made a fatal mistake. She opened the car door wide, and as she did, the people outside, including the media, got a clear view of their compromising position. The flash of cameras was immediate, capturing every mortifying detail. Samara, shocked and embarrassed, scrambled out of the car, her face a mask of horror. Vasper, equally startled, slammed the door shut and sped out of the garage without a second glance. Samara was left standing there, exposed to the world, her blouse still unbuttoned, her bra exposed, her dress crumpled, and her hair a tangled mess. She covered her face as cameras continued to flash, capturing every humiliating second. Raphael approached her, his expression bewildered, while the security personnel, unsure of how to react, averted their eyes in awkward embarrassment. Laika, who had been watching the entire scene unfold from a distance, feigned concern but was inwardly delighted. Thanks to her supernatural ability to hear from afar, she had caught every word exchanged in Vasper's car. The scandal that would inevitably follow was precisely what she had been hoping for. Everything was falling perfectly into place according to her plan. As Vasper drove down the road, his entire body trembled with rage at what had happened. His anger wasn't just directed at the situation but also at himself for getting entangled in it. Furious with himself for the situation he had gotten into. Samara had proven to be the most stubborn, hard-headed woman he'd ever encountered. Perhaps it was because she was a princess, accustomed to always getting her way, that she had never realized how deeply obsessed she had become with him. Vasper cursed himself for not thinking clearly earlier. He should have handled Samara discreetly. Now, it was too late. He hadn't thought to deal with Samara away from prying eyes to avoid any footage being captured. His emotions had gotten the best of him, leading to a confrontation with Samara that was nothing short of explosive. He had let his emotions and anger get the better of him, clouding his judgment. In the heat of the moment, he even forgot to pick up the food he was supposed to bring for Chanty from the restaurant. Frustration boiled over as he slammed his fists repeatedly against the steering wheel, his vision darkening with the intensity of his rage, particularly towards Laika. It was Laika who had dragged Samara to that restaurant, and now, without a doubt, they were the latest gossip, plastered all over the news. People in other cars turned their heads to watch Vasper's speeding vehicle. Shaking their heads in wonder, questioning who could be behind the wheel of such a stunning, high-performance sports car, the latest model, designed to turn heads, grabbing in every way. Sports cars had always been Vasper's obsession, one of the few passions he had never let go of. In the past, before he met Chanty, his passenger seat had never been empty, there was always a beautiful woman beside him. To him, a sports car wasn't complete without a gorgeous companion in the passenger seat. But his life had changed drastically now. His life had taken a different direction. The incident with Samara. What happened between them was just one example of the unexpected things that were now occurring in his life. "Vasper, what's wrong with you?" he blurted out inside his car. His voice filled with self-loathing. "Why couldn't you just give Samara what she wanted, if only for a moment?" He continued to berate himself. He knew he could have satisfied Samara in bed, given her what she desired, just like before. But why did his body rebel now? Why did he feel nothing but disgust? Why couldn't his body comply anymore? What had changed within him? What had happened to him? It's no doubt because of her, Chanty. The only woman he only desired to be with. For the rest of his life. he pulled over to the side of the road, staring blankly out the window, lost in thought, reflecting on everything that had happened. He caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror and noticed the marks on his face, scratches from Samara's nails. The clear imprint of Samara's hand was evidence of how powerful her slaps had been, leaving a visible mark on his cheek as if it had been printed there, his cheek still flushed with the imprint of her hand. The clear outline of her palm was a testament to the force behind her slaps, the sting still lingering like a burn. His cheek felt warm and numb, but he had no intention of tending to it. He needed the evidence for when he faced Chanty later. He crossed his fingers, hoping that the scene at the restaurant hadn't been broadcasted live. As the traffic on the road began to thin out, he waited for the moment when it was quiet enough, then teleported himself and his car to David's garage. Upon reappearing in David's place, the first person he saw upon arrival was Jake. Instantly, Vasper's protective instincts kicked in. "Where's Chanty? Where is she?" he demanded, his voice edged with urgency. Jake stood by the door, his expression stern and serious, his gaze unflinchingly fixed on Vasper and his car. A sardonic smile played on Jake's lips, taunting Vasper silently. "Bastard," Vasper muttered under his breath. For a moment, they stood in a tense standoff, their eyes locked in a fierce, unspoken battle of wills. Finally, Vasper moved, stepping out of his car with swift, determined movements. He slammed the car door shut with a force that echoed his deadly serious expression, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "You should be thankful I didn't catch you at your house today," Vasper whispered into the air, knowing full well that Jake could hear him. Jake's eyes narrowed further, his gaze sharpening as he watched Vasper closely. Vasper's hand slipped into his pocket, touching the suspended bracelet. Intended for Jake, a silent reminder that this wasn't the time or place for a confrontation. Vasper knew he couldn't cause a scene at David's house, but he silently promised himself that Jake's time would come. He was just waiting for the right moment with Jake. Vasper didn't take the usual path through the door where Jake stood. He teleported directly into the living room. There, he found Jacob, Justin, and Marco, with Chanty sitting in the middle of the sofa, clutching a pillow. Her eyes were red and swollen, clear evidence that she had been crying. Does she already know? Vasper's heart sank. Chanty didn't even glance in his direction. Only Jacob, Justin, and Marco did. Jake remained at a distance, his eyes still fixed on Vasper with that sardonic smile. Despite his intense anger towards Jake, Vasper held himself back, knowing he was in David's house and didn't want to be the one to start trouble. "Your time will come, Jake. Just wait," Vasper thought to himself. Jacob's expression was indescribable. He looked at Vasper with an expression that suggested he was struggling to suppress laughter. A reaction that only irritated Vasper further. "What's so funny, Jacob?" Vasper asked, his voice laced with irritation as he moved closer to Chanty. Chanty finally looked at him with a mixture of confusion, sadness, and tears. He approached her, but for some reason, he hesitated. Why did he feel so uncertain? He wasn't guilty of anything, was he? Justin stood up, breaking the tension. "Vasper, is that from Samara's slap? It's like her handprint is etched on your face," Justin remarked, stepping aside to let Vasper get closer to Chanty. "Why is she in the middle of the three guardians?" Chanty positioned herself between Justin, Marco, and Jacob as Jake earlier entered the living room. She quickly ran to the sofa, positioning herself between Justin, Marco, and Jacob, afraid Jake might come into her room and they would be left alone, clearly uncomfortable with Jake's presence. Jake misinterpreted Chanty's move, thinking she was now so afraid of him that she would do anything to avoid him. Chanty didn't make eye contact with Jake. Justin and the others watched Jake closely, ensuring he didn't get too close to her. Vasper stepped towards Chanty, but she didn't acknowledge him. Suddenly, she stood up and ran to her room, leaving Vasper standing there, his mouth slightly agape in surprise. He looked at Justin and the others, deliberately avoiding Jake's gaze. They all exchanged knowing looks as Justin turned on the TV. Vasper didn't need an explanation. Chanty had seen the news. Once again, he and Samara were the headline. Vasper turned his attention to the TV screen and saw the footage of their time at the restaurant. The camera had caught everything: Samara kissing him, her hand sliding up his thigh, all of it. His eyes widened as he looked at Justin, but Justin remained silent. The footage even showed Samara getting into his car, the movements of the car, and how it looked as though something had happened inside, and then before exiting, Samara sitting provocatively on his lap in full view. Her hair disheveled as if she'd just escaped a storm. Her blouse hung open, revealing a glimpse of her bra, a sight sure to invite misinterpretation by anyone watching. The TV reports had it all wrong, showcasing an exaggerated version of events that couldn't be further from the truth. That's not what really happened. Vasper's voice cut through the tension in the room. The reality is different from what they're showing. It was Samara who came at me. Did you not see the scratches on my face? Vasper revealed his bruised and scratched face, his anger palpable. Yet, amidst all this, his thoughts kept circling back to Laika, who was clearly at the center of this scheme. However, neither Justin nor the others said a word, observing the unfolding drama. You don't owe us an explanation, Vasper, Marco finally spoke up. Save that for Chanty. We saw everything on TV, and honestly, there's no point in explaining anymore. Jake, standing at a distance, couldn't resist adding his 2 cents. Typical behavior for a man trying to sail 2 boats at once, he said, casting a sharp glance at Vasper. Vasper's gaze darkened, locking onto Jake with a look of suppressed fury. Jake! Don't start this. Not now, Justin warned, sensing the tension escalating and trying to prevent a fight. Ignoring Jake, Vasper wasted no time. He teleported directly to Shanta's room, leaving the others behind. Inside Shanta's room, Chanty was lying on the bed, her face still wet with tears. As soon as she saw Vasper, her eyes locked onto his, cold and distant. So, you said you wouldn't see Samara again? Is that why you didn't stay for lunch, because you had plans to meet her at a restaurant? Shanta's voice was bitter, her pain evident. She had just finished watching the news and had been crying uncontrollably. Vasper approached her, his face full of regret and desperation. Chanty, I had no idea Laika and Samara would be there with Mr. Hudson. I was trapped. Laika orchestrated the entire meeting. Even Hudson admitted he was forced by Laika to bring her along. What you saw on TV wasn't the truth. Look at my face, Vasper pointed to the scratches, his voice breaking. Samara attacked me in the car. What you saw wasn't what really happened. Please, don't believe what you saw on the screen. Vasper pleaded, his voice carrying the weight of the truth he desperately wanted Chanty to understand. Shanta looked at him, her gaze lingering on the marks on his cheek. That's the truth, Chanty. What you saw, when the car was shaking, was because of the chaos inside. I didn't fight back because I couldn't bring myself to hurt her physically. It's not in my nature to harm a woman. Vasper moved closer, gently holding Shanta's hands. Please don't be angry with me, can you forgive me? His eyes were pleading, full of sorrow and regret. Shanta stared at him for a long moment, her gaze lingering on his bruised cheek. So what does this mean now? What you're saying is that Samara hasn't accepted the breakup? That she still believes you two are together? Her voice was fragile, barely above a whisper. Vasper, we're meeting at the vineyard tomorrow, Shanta's voice cracked as tears welled up in her eyes again. Vasper pulled her into a tight embrace. I'm so sorry, Chanty, he whispered, his voice thick with remorse and guilt. The weight of his chaotic life with Samara bore down on him, and now, it was Chanty who was suffering because of it. Please, tomorrow, don't come to the vineyard. Let David and the others handle it. It'll be easier for me if you're not there. If you're there, it'll make things more complicated for me, Chanty begged, tears finally streaming down her face. Vasper wiped her tears gently. I'll wait in the car then. I won't show myself, he promised, he assured her, placing a tender kiss on her forehead. But as he moved to kiss her lips, Chanty turned away, pulling back. Vasper felt a pang of hurt at her rejection. I feel like I'm the villain in her life. Did you see how miserable she looked on TV? Her beauty may be untouched, but her emotional state, it's as if I'm the cause of her suffering. I don't want to be the cause of her suffering, Vasper. Chanty said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. I don't want to live like this, Chanty explained, her voice filled with pain. Vasper pulled her close, his embrace desperate. Chanty, you're not the cause. I am. It's all my fault. Please, don't blame yourself, he pleaded. Vasper's voice was heavy with guilt. How can it not be my fault? You broke up with her because of me, didn't you? Chanty's voice cracked as she began to sob again. What will people think of me if they find out you're my boyfriend? Earlier, when I saw you on TV, why couldn't we just eat at the restaurant together? She questioned, her voice filled with anguish. Vasper fell silent, her words cutting deep like a knife. She questioned, her words like a dagger to Vasper's heart. Vasper remained silent, the weight of her words heavy on his chest. Vasper, please, tomorrow don't come to the vineyard, I'm begging you, Chanty pleaded, turning her back on him as she lay down on the bed, her heart heavy with sorrow. Her body trembling with the intensity of her emotions. Vasper, his heart heavy, sat beside her, watching her as she cried, her sobs muffled by the pillow. Her chest felt tight, her breath coming in short gasps as she struggled with the overwhelming weight of her emotions. Vasper, too, was burdened, his face reflecting the sorrow he felt as he watched her cry. Vasper wanted nothing more than to hold her, to kiss away her pain. Can I lie beside you? Vasper whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with longing. Chanty didn't respond, but Vasper slowly lay down beside her, facing her back, careful not to touch her. He wanted to hold her so badly, but he hesitated, afraid of her rejection. He desperately wanted to hold her but hesitated, fearing she might push him away. Can I hold you? Just hold you, no kisses, I promise. Vasper asked again, his voice pleading. Please, Chanty, just a hug, he pleaded, his eyes begging for her forgiveness. But Chanty shifted away from him, moving to the edge of the bed. The distance between them felt like a chasm, and Vasper's heart shattered. And he sighed heavily, watching her move further away. Please go back to your house, Vasper, Chanty said quietly but firmly, and Vasper felt the sting of her words. Maybe I should go back home, Vasper replied, his voice heavy with resignation. But Jake is outside. Who knows what he might do, he added sternly. Jake, who had been listening from afar, clenched his fists in anger, his temper flaring, clearly hearing the conversation between Chanty and Vasper. Justin and the others exchanged glances, knowing Jake was on edge, ready to explode at any moment, watching Jake's reaction closely. Vasper. Justin and the others are watching over me. It'll be easier for me if I don't see you from now until the meeting is over tomorrow, Chanty said, turning to face him as she sat up on the bed, her expression resolute. Vasper, looking pained, stared back at her, the pain in his eyes evident. Vasper looked at her. Fine. I'll leave, but not before I get a hug, he said, standing up and approaching. I'll leave only after one last hug, Vasper insisted. Chanty's eyes widened in surprise. Please, just one last time, he pleaded, pulling her into a hug as she sat on the bed. Chanty didn't resist the embrace, but Vasper gently pushed her back onto the bed, leaning over her. He kissed her passionately, seeking her response. Chanty didn't resist, opening her mouth to his kiss. It was hungry, fervent, full of longing, her mouth opening to his, their kiss deepening. Vasper's kisses were filled with longing, each one more fervent than the last. He looked into her eyes, his voice hushed as he spoke. I love you so much, Chanty. Please don't let go. I need you. I can't live without you, Vasper murmured, his voice low and full of emotion. No matter what challenges we face, please don't let go of me. Stay with me. You're the only woman I've ever loved like this, no one else, only you, he continued, taking Chanty's hand and placing it over his heart. You're the only one in here. Vasper added, his voice filled with sincerity. Chanty remained silent, gazing into his eyes, then down at his lips. He captured her lips in another searing kiss. I miss you. I want you right now, Vasper whispered against her lips, his voice barely audible to avoid being overheard outside. Chanty didn't respond. She wasn't in the mood to reciprocate his advances, her mind elsewhere. Vasper, sensing her reluctance, suddenly remembered something, signaling for Chanty to stay quiet as he reached into his pocket. Chanty watched, curious as he pulled out the panties Jake had taken from her, holding them up to her face. She gasped in shock when she saw her panty, the one Jake had taken from her, now in Vasper's hand. "What?" Chanty mouthed in shock. Vasper nodded, holding a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. He brought the fabric to his nose, inhaling deeply while his eyes remained locked on Chanty's. The pheromone scent that lingered on the cloth still had a powerful effect on him. Her scent, still strong on the fabric, had an immediate effect on him. Vasper seemingly intoxicated, Chanty's face flushed with embarrassment as she watched him. She didn't know how to feel, her emotions in turmoil. She quickly snatched the panty from his hand, mortified, and threw it towards the trash bin. Both of them watched as the panties hung on the edge of the trash bin's lid. When they looked back at each other, Vasper leaned in for another, more heated kiss. This time, his hands roamed her body, but Chanty resisted, trying to control herself. "Vasper. Please?" "Not this time," Chanty said firmly, her tone hushed but resolute. Vasper forced a bitter smile, his heart aching as he remained on top of her. "Go home," Chanty insisted. Vasper slowly got up, but Chanty stayed lying on the bed, watching him. "Fine. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll take you to the vineyard." "I won't get out of the car, I'll just wait," Vasper said sternly, looking directly at her. Before she could react, Vasper had already disappeared from her sight. Chanty pressed her hand to her forehead, frustrated and confused by how stubborn Vasper could be. In haste, she got up and grabbed the panty that was resting on top of the trash can, throwing it inside the bin with a look of disgust. The thought of Jake holding it made her stomach turn. She couldn't bear the idea of wearing it again. But then a question crossed her mind: how did Vasper get hold of my panty? She realized she had forgotten to ask him. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her head aching from the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. As the night deepened, a heavy stillness settled over the house, wrapping it in a shroud of silence that only heightened Chanty's restlessness. Sleep eluded her, the turmoil within her heart too overwhelming to allow any semblance of peace. The shadows seemed to stretch long and eerie in the night, pressing down on her like the weight of her own thoughts. The living room, once alive with David's commanding presence, was now a silent echo of the chaos that had erupted from Alexander Mondragon's elves. Furniture lay askew, remnants of the intense emotions that had swept through the space like a storm. Yet, it wasn't just the physical disarray that lingered, the air itself felt charged, as if the very walls had absorbed the tension and now held it in a hushed, anxious stillness. Chanty knew she wasn't alone. The presence of Jacob, Justin, and Marco was there. She could sense them, like silent guardians, their eyes watchful and vigilant as they kept a close, protective watch over the house. Even Jake's presence, though not visible, was palpable to her, a familiar and unsettling awareness that pricked at the edges of her consciousness. Unable to stay still, Chanty drifted outside to the gazebo, seeking solace in the quiet night air. She sat down, the cool wood beneath her a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts: Samara, Vasper, the guilt that gnawed at her, the confusion that muddied her heart. She couldn't understand why she felt so guilty about Samara. Should she? Was it wrong to hold on to Vasper so fiercely? He was her first love, the one who had awakened her heart, but why did everything have to be so complicated, so painful? She longed for simplicity, for the kind of love that didn't come with such heavy burdens. In her mind, she saw the figure of Alexander Mondragon, the source of so much of their suffering, and she yearned to confront him, to end the torment that had cast a shadow over her and Vasper's love. If only Alexander were out of the picture, maybe then they could finally be free. The sudden sound of her name broke the silence, and Chanty's heart skipped a beat. "Chanty," Jake's voice called softly, and she looked up to see him standing just outside the gazebo, his hands tucked into his pockets. His long hair cascaded over his shoulders, framing his face in the dim light. He wore a black t-shirt and jeans, his figure blending almost seamlessly into the night, except for the glint of his eyes that caught the light. There was a tension in the air now, a shift that made Shanta's pulse quicken with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. She forced herself to remain calm, to keep her composure even as she noticed Jacob, Justin, and Marco standing nearby, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them, their postures alert and ready. Jake's bitter chuckle broke the silence, his gaze drifting to where Justin stood, not far from them. "Do you all really think I'm that bad?" he asked, his tone laced with a sadness that cut through Shanta's heart. She followed his gaze, seeing Justin and the others standing guard, their eyes never wavering from Jake. "Jake, as long as you don't do anything but talk, we have no problem with you," Marco replied, his voice steady but firm, a quiet warning embedded within. "We still have some trust in you, Jake, but only a little," Jacob added, his tone cautious. Though they were some distance away, their voices carried clearly in the night air, their heightened senses making it impossible for Chanty to miss a single word. She kept her eyes downcast, pretending not to listen, but every word resonated within her. Jake didn't respond to Justin or the others. Instead, he turned his full attention back to Chanty. "May I come in and sit in front of you?" he asked softly, his voice gentle, almost pleading. "Please, Chanty, let go of your fear of me. I'm not what you think." There was something in his voice, a sincerity that reached deep into the turmoil within her, soothing the edges of her anxiety. She looked up at him, their eyes meeting and holding each other's gaze for a long, silent moment. Emotions passed between them, uncertainty, fear, but also a deep, unspoken connection. Finally, she nodded, giving him permission to enter. Jake stepped into the gazebo and sat across from her, his gaze lingering on her face. In his eyes, she could see the love, the admiration, the longing he held for her, a depth of emotion that both unnerved and comforted her. But in her own gaze, there was only friendship, nothing more, a boundary she kept firmly in place. They sat in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken words. If Chanty were a candle, she would have melted under the intensity of Jake's stare, the way his eyes seemed to drink her in, as if he could never have enough. His gaze had always been like this, and she should have been used to it by now, but it still made her heart flutter, just a little. "How are you feeling?" Jake's sudden question broke the silence, his voice low and filled with concern. Shanta looked at him, her voice steady as she answered, "I'm not okay. But I'll force myself to be, because there's no other choice but to keep going even though everything's a mess." Jake laughed bitterly, a sound that was more a sigh than anything else. "You do have a choice," he said, his voice tinged with a deep sadness that mirrored the ache in Shanta's heart. She stared at him, her gaze searching, trying to understand the depth of his pain. She smiled faintly and asked softly, "What kind of choice are you suggesting, Jake?" Her tone was gentle, matching the stillness of the night, a quiet invitation for him to speak his heart. "Someone like me," Jake replied bluntly, his eyes never leaving hers. "If you were with me, you wouldn't have to suffer like this because of Samara or any of Vasper's other women." His gaze was serious, intense, and Chanty met it with equal seriousness, understanding the weight of his words. She remained silent, waiting for him to finish, knowing there was more he wanted to say. "With me, Chanty, it would be like breathing normally. We could do things in public, no need to hide. You'd be proud to introduce your boyfriend, and I'd be proud to introduce you to the world. I can give you everything Vasper can, material things included. You wouldn't have to suffer the guilt you feel now when you're with me. Just give me a chance to show you how much I love you." Jake's voice was pleading, soothing, almost a whisper, a gentle caress that made Shanta's heart ache. Justin and the others, who had been listening silently, exchanged glances, the weight of Jake's bold declaration sinking in. Shanta looked at Jake, her fear of him slowly dissipating under the calmness of his voice, the sincerity of his words. "Jake," Chanty began, her voice trembling slightly, "I wish it were that simple to choose, especially when it comes to my love. But what can I do when he's the one my heart cries out for? I can't bear to lose him, Jake. But I can crossfire and storm for him." Tears began to well up in her eyes, spilling over as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's expression reflected the pain her words caused him, as if a knife were being driven into his chest. "There's no room left in my heart for anyone else, Jake. It's all occupied by Vasper. He's the only man I want to be with for the rest of my life. I can't live without him, Chanty continued, her voice breaking with emotion. The woman you love is very lucky, Jake, she added, her tone soft, trying to ease the sting of her rejection. You are that woman, Chanty, Jake replied in an ear whisper, his words carrying the weight of a heart laid bare. Chanty fell silent, staring at Jake, her lips slightly parted in surprise. You're the only woman I've ever loved like this, and I can't bear to lose you. I'd rather endure the pain of seeing you with Vasper every day than stay away from you. You're like the air I breathe, Chanty. Jake's voice was filled with raw emotion, and Chanty saw tears welling up in his eyes, the depth of his feelings laid bare before her. Jake, I don't want to be the cause of your pain. You can walk away from me, Jake. You're free to do so. There's nothing stopping you from moving on, finding someone else, and forgetting me, Chanty said, her voice heavy with sorrow. Jake let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh against the quiet night. If only that were part of my powers, Chanty, to have the strength to walk away from you. But I don't have that power. If I force myself to, I might go insane, Jake said, his gaze turning away, looking into the distance as if searching for something, anything to ease the torment in his heart. Chanty's heart ached for him, wishing there was something she could do, some way to ease his pain, but she knew there was nothing she could offer that would be enough. Forgive me for what I've taken from you, but I'll give it back to you, Jake said, his words heavy with regret. Chanty understood what he meant, but she didn't look at him. She knew that Jake was still unaware that Vasper had already reclaimed what was his, and she had no intention of telling him. It was a truth that weighed heavily on her, but she chose to keep it buried, hidden beneath layers of unspoken pain. I was carried away by my feelings. It won't happen again, Jake continued, his voice tinged with a sorrow that seemed to echo in the quiet night. Chanty finally looked at him, her gaze filled with understanding, recognizing the depth of his emotions, the struggle he faced. Jake, please, don't let there be constant conflict between you and Vasper because of me. I don't want you to get hurt because of our friendship, and the same goes for Vasper. He's important to me, Jake, Chanty said softly, her voice a gentle plea, hoping to bridge the gap that had formed between the two men she cared about. Jake gave a faint, bittersweet smile. I can't promise that, Chanty. Because Vasper already has plans for me. I can sense his anger towards me, he wants me gone from this world. So I can't make that promise, Jake added, his words sending a jolt of shock through Chanty. The gravity of his statement hung in the air, a dark cloud that seemed to overshadow everything else. As long as you're here, as long as I keep fighting for my love for you, the chaos between Vasper and me will never end. I'll keep fighting for you, Chanty. For how long? Until the day of your wedding. On that day, I won't trouble you anymore. I'll respect your marriage, Jake said, his voice resolute, yet tinged with a sadness that was impossible to ignore. Chanty was speechless, stunned by the intensity of Jake's declaration. The weight of his words pressed down on her, leaving her breathless, unsure of how to respond. Jake stood up then, exhaling deeply, as if trying to release all the pain that had built up inside him. He looked out into the distance, his eyes unfocused, as though he were seeing something far beyond the night's horizon. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly, the effort of holding himself together evident in every movement. Thank you for giving me this chance to talk to you face to face. These moments are special to me, Jake said, his voice softened by the raw emotion he was trying to contain. He gazed at Chanty with love, longing, and a deep, abiding sorrow that seemed to fill the space between them. Chanty remained silent, her heart heavy with the burden of all that had been said. She watched as Jake slowly walked past her, his steps measured and deliberate. As he neared her, he leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered softly, I love you so much, Chanty. Please be mine someday. His voice was a fragile thread, a desperate plea that tugged at her heartstrings. And then, just as quickly, he pulled away, his figure retreating into the darkness, swallowed by the night. Chanty was left sitting there, her mind a whirl of emotions, her heart aching with the intensity of everything she had heard. The night air felt colder now, the silence heavier, as if the world itself had taken a breath and was waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. Justin and the others, who had been silent witnesses to the entire exchange, finally allowed themselves to relax. They exchanged glances, a shared understanding passing between them. They had heard everything, felt the weight of Jake's words, and now, as his presence faded into the night, they breathed a collective sigh of relief. They stood guard, their senses alert, but with the tension of the moment dissipated, they felt a small measure of peace return. For now, at least, the immediate threat had passed. Jake was gone, presumably back to his home, and the night could finally return to its usual quiet, albeit with the heavy residue of the emotions that had been stirred up. Chanty remained in the gazebo, her thoughts racing, her heart still pounding in her chest. Jake's words echoed in her mind, the sincerity and pain in his voice lingering in the air around her. She felt a deep sadness for him, for the love he held that she could never return in the way he desired. But she also felt a sense of resolve, a determination to hold on to what mattered most to her, her love for Vasper, no matter how complicated or difficult it might be. As the night stretched on, Chanty knew that the path ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more heartache, but she was prepared to face them. For Vasper, for the love they shared, she would endure whatever came their way. And with that thought, she finally allowed herself to rise, her steps slow and deliberate as she made her way back into the house. The night was far from over, and the weight of what had transpired would stay with her, but for now, she would take solace in the small moments of quiet, in the knowledge that she wasn't alone in this fight. Jake stood at the edge of his new yacht, a lone figure framed against the vast and endless horizon of the sea. The world around him seemed to hold its breath as he stared into the distance, lost in a turmoil of emotions. He had just teleported from his conversation with Chanty, his mind still reeling from the encounter. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, his tall, broad-shouldered frame standing out against the infinite expanse of the ocean, a striking silhouette in the dim light of the night. The cool breeze ruffled his tousled hair, but it did nothing to soothe the tempest raging within him. A man of undeniable power and allure, his face held a timeless beauty that could make any woman fall at his feet, except Chanty. Jake was a man who could have had it all, a presence so magnetic that time seemed to pause in his wake. But all the charm, all the power he possessed, crumbled before the unyielding reality that the woman who had claimed his heart, Chanty, loved another. Despite his overwhelming attractiveness, his powerful stature, and his undeniable appeal, he was no match for Vasper, the man who had captured Chanty's heart, the woman Jake longed to be with until his last breath. The harsh truth was a bitter pill to swallow. Vasper had won Chanty's love. Jake's gaze shifted, drifting toward his mansion perched high on the rocky cliffs. It overlooked the secluded beach and the seemingly infinite ocean, a dreamy landscape of pristine beauty. The mansion, a fortress of solitude hidden from the prying eyes of the world, was a testament to his wealth and influence. The light spilling from its grand windows onto the jagged rocks below cast an ethereal glow, giving the scene an almost otherworldly beauty. This house, though solitary, was a place he had yearned to bring Chanty, a place where they could be together, away from the world's scrutiny. It was one of many properties Jake owned around the globe, but it held special significance due to its isolation, far from neighboring islands, hidden from mortal eyes. But to Jake, it was all empty, a kingdom without its queen. He had envisioned bringing Chanty here, to this remote paradise, where they could be alone, far from the world that had denied him her love. As he looked up at the sky, the stars shimmered, and the nearly full moon cast a silver sheen across the water, a sight so breathtaking it deepened the ache in Jake's chest. The loneliness and sorrow in his heart mirrored the serene beauty around him. The only sound was the gentle crash of the waves against the yacht, a rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with the pain in his soul. Jake closed his eyes, and Chanty's image flooded his mind. He could still see the way she had looked at him earlier. The closeness they had shared, the temptation to pull her into his arms, to kiss her, had been almost unbearable. But he had resisted, knowing that her heart was not his to claim. How long could he keep torturing himself like this? How long could he endure the agony of loving a woman who could never be his? But there was still time to change the course of their destinies, to rewrite the stars that had so cruelly aligned against him. He wouldn't give up, not yet, not until every possibility had been exhausted. It was as clear as daylight that Chanty's love belonged to Vasper, a truth he had long accepted, but he refused to concede defeat in his battle with Vasper for Chanty's heart. The fight was not over. Chanty was not yet bound in marriage. There was still time, still a chance for fate to change, for one of the three of them. And if it did, Jake would ensure Chanty ended up with him. He took a deep, long breath, his eyes fixed on the distant sea. The moonlight reflected off the water, a sight he longed to share with Chanty. In his mind, he imagined her standing at the edge of the yacht, while he embraced her tightly from behind, kissing her neck until they both melted into the warmth of their passion under the moonlight. Just the two of them, alone in the vast ocean. The thought ignited a fire within him, a burning desire that refused to be extinguished. Suddenly, his eyes snapped to the single bed inside the yacht's cabin. The pillow where he had placed Shanta's white lingerie, intending to return it to her, was now empty. In an instant, he teleported inside, frantically searching every corner of the cabin, hoping the lingerie had merely been blown away by the wind, but it was nowhere to be found. The delicate fabric was gone. He stood, puzzled by the disappearance of the garment when a scene flashed in his mind. He recalled Vasper's return to David's mansion, hearing him mutter to the wind, "You're lucky I didn't catch you at your place." Jake's expression darkened. It was possible Vasper had come from his yacht and taken Shanta's lingerie. Rage surged through Jake's body at the thought. He sat on the bed, his hands gripping his head, his legs splayed apart, his elbows resting on his knees. He closed his eyes, trying to calm himself. But the fury in his chest was boiling over. He needed to release it. In a flash, he teleported to the beach, standing on a large rock, and screamed Vasper's name with unbridled rage and anger, his fists clenched, ready to strike the rock he imagined to be Vasper's face. But he suddenly fell silent when he noticed large chunks of stone scattered on the sand. They had broken off from the very rock he was standing on. These pieces weren't there the last time he left the island. He inspected the fragments, knowing that such rocks wouldn't break unless struck by an immense force. Using his powers to see through the night, he scanned the rocks for blood, and he wasn't mistaken, there was blood. There was no doubt in his mind, only Vasper could have caused this. It was certain now, Vasper had been on his island and had taken Shanta's lingerie from his pillow, and he had left his mark. Suddenly, Jake spun around, sensing a powerful presence behind him. It was Vasper, standing there, his expression deadly serious. One hand was in his pocket, dressed in a suit, a watch on his left wrist, his body facing the sea while his head turned towards Jake. After years of observing Vasper's movements, Jake knew what the watch meant. Vasper never wore one unless he was on an important mission that required his personal intervention. Instantly, Jake was on high alert, fully aware of Vasper's intentions at this hour, no need to ask. Their eyes locked in a fierce stare down, both men exuding an aura of ferocity. They moved like lions, slow yet deliberate, fists clenched, muscles twitching with the tension of their grinding teeth. Their anger toward each other was palpable, rooted in the same reason, Chanty. The woman they both wanted to be with for the rest of their lives, the woman they both loved. The one who owned their hearts. But only one of them held Shanta's heart, Vasper. And Jake, determined to steal Shanta's love, was the reason Vasper wanted to erase him from existence. Their countless confrontations, sparked by Jake's determination to win Chanty, had pushed Vasper to his limit. The two men stood in silence, the tension between them crackling like electricity in the air. They were like two predators circling each other, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Their mutual hatred was palpable, fueled by their love for the same woman. Chanty was the axis around which their entire world revolved, the reason for their unending feud. And now, with Vasper standing there, mocking him with that infuriatingly calm demeanor, Jake felt his control slipping away. After a long, tense silence between them, Vasper's voice cut through the night, smooth and deadly, "Jake, don't worry. I've already returned Shanta's lingerie that you stole." His smile was infuriating in Jake's eyes, like a dagger to Jake's heart. "Next time, Jake, make sure the owner of the underwear you take actually belongs to you, so at least even what she wears is yours," Vasper added mockingly. In a fit of uncontrollable anger, Jake's laughter burst forth, a maniacal sound that echoed across the desolate island. It was a wild, unhinged laugh, the kind that bounced off the rocks and reverberated across the sea, unsettling in its intensity. But there was no humor in it, only a desperate, seething rage that clawed its way out of him, begging for release. His eyes gleamed with madness, and his laughter seemed to taunt the very night. Vasper remained silent, his expression as cold and unreadable as stone. He stood his ground, unwavering, but ready, his entire being alert, muscles coiled like a predator waiting to strike. As Jake's laughter faded into the night, an eerie silence settled over them. In an instant, Jake teleported, appearing directly in front of Vasper. Without hesitation, they lunged at each other, their hands gripping each other's collars, their faces mere inches apart. The heat of their rage radiated off their bodies, their breath mingling in the charged air. And then, the battle began. Their fists flew, fast and fierce, each blow a testament to their immense strength and agility. Under the silver glow of the moon, in the dark of night, these two beings clashed with all their might. Both possessed the power of teleportation, both were strong and quick, and both were consumed by a hatred that burned as hot as the sun. The fight was brutal, their movements a blur of violence, each strike more vicious than the last. Jake was the first to be sent flying by the sheer force of Vasper's punch. His back smashed into a large rock, but instead of shattering Jake's body, it was the rock that crumbled into pieces. Wasting no time, Vasper closed in, grabbing Jake by the collar and hurling him onto the sand with such force that the ground cratered beneath him. Without a moment's pause, Vasper unleashed a relentless series of punches, each one echoing like thunderclaps across the island. They moved faster than the eye could see, teleporting around the island as they exchanged devastating punches and kicks, their speed and ferocity defying reason. Jake struggled to keep up with Vasper's lightning-fast moves. They teleported again and again, their locations changing with each second, their brutal fight leaving devastation in its wake. At one point, Jake's powerful kick sent Vasper crashing into the large rock near his yacht. But with his protective instincts kicking in, Jake teleported Vasper to the far side of the island, away from his mansion and yacht. Vasper's fist connected with Jake's jaw, sending him hurtling into a massive boulder. The rock shattered on impact, but Jake was already on his feet, his eyes blazing with fury. He teleported behind Vasper, grabbing him by the collar and hurling him into the air. But Vasper twisted mid-flight, slamming Jake into the sand with bone-crushing force. Now shirtless, their bodies glistened with sweat and blood, their faces twisted in rage and pain. But neither was willing to back down, neither willing to give an inch. They clashed like thunder and lightning, their strength and power unyielding, each man a force of nature in his own right. But Vasper knew what Jake valued most. In a move so fast it was almost imperceptible, Vasper teleported Jake back onto his yacht, smashing him into the cabin with such force that the entire vessel groaned under the strain. The impact was so great that Jake's newly purchased yacht was destroyed, a twisted wreck of metal and wood. Jake's fury knew no bounds. Seeing his yacht, a symbol of his power and wealth, reduced to nothing, he was consumed with rage. But even as blood streamed down Vasper's face, he laughed, a maniacal sound that only fueled Jake's wrath. Jake screamed Vasper's name in fury, but Vasper only seemed more resolute. Not satisfied with the destruction he had caused, Vasper grabbed Jake again, lifting him high above the deck, his face twisted in a snarl. Jake struggled, trying to break free, but Vasper's grip was unyielding. With a final, earth-shattering blow, Vasper slammed Jake onto the deck, shattering the yacht's steering wheel and leaving a gaping hole where the engine had been. Jake's yacht was beyond recognition, with a hole leading straight through to the engine. Jake lay on the deck, gasping for breath, his body bruised and battered. But he wasn't finished. With a burst of energy, he teleported behind Vasper, landing a punch that sent Vasper flying into the ocean. But even as Vasper hit the water, he teleported back onto the deck, his wounds already healing, his eyes burning with an unholy light. Jake managed to grab hold of Vasper, but Vasper was quicker, breaking free from Jake's grasp. Their movements were too fast for ordinary eyes to follow, like gusts of wind suddenly sweeping through. The island itself seemed to tremble under the force of their battle, rocks shattered, sand flew, and the very air crackled with their power. Their handsome faces were bloodied, their brows furrowed, and lips split with cuts on their cheeks and other parts of their bodies. But Vasper had the advantage of instant self-healing powers. Eventually, they separated, both panting heavily, their eyes still locked in a deadly stare. A sardonic smile played on their lips, as if mocking the other's efforts. Within seconds, Vasper's wounds were healing, while Jake's were slowly mending, but at a much slower pace compared to Vasper. With a roar, Jake launched himself at Vasper, teleporting them both to the far side of the island, where they continued their brutal fight. The night was filled with the sound of their struggle, the impact of their blows echoing across the water. But despite Jake's best efforts, Vasper was always one step ahead, always ready with a counterattack. They stood there, panting, bloodied, their chests heaving with exertion. But despite the toll the battle had taken, neither man was ready to surrender. They were like gods of war, their power and determination unmatched, their love for Chanty driving them to the brink of madness. And as they stared each other down, the night around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would make the next move. And in that moment, as the stars wheeled overhead and the ocean whispered against the shore, it became clear that this battle was far from over. For as long as Chanty's heart remained unclaimed, Jake and Vasper would continue to fight, each willing to tear the world apart for the woman they loved. In the eerie silence of the night, Jake moved like a shadow, teleporting behind Vasper in an instant. His movements were so swift and silent that Vasper remained oblivious until it was too late. With a deadly precision, Jake seized both of Vasper's arms in one hand, yanking them behind his back. His other hand clamped around Vasper's throat with a grip of iron, cutting off any chance of escape. Vasper's body arched backward in a futile attempt to resist, but Jake's strength was unyielding, forcing his arms into an excruciating position that left Vasper immobilized. The pressure was relentless, bending Vasper's will and body alike as they began to ascend rapidly into the night sky. Higher and higher they soared, the air growing thinner with each passing second, turning every breath into a desperate struggle. The icy wind whipped around them, but Jake's hold on Vasper remained as unbreakable as his resolve. "Do you know how to fly, Vasper?" Jake's voice cut through the howling wind, deadly serious, each word dripping with lethal intent. Vasper tried to respond, but Jake's chokehold was too tight, it strangled any words before they could escape. With brutal precision, Jake twisted Vasper around to face him, maintaining that suffocating grip on his throat. Without warning, Jake's fist drove into Vasper's chest, aiming directly for his heart. The force of the blow sent shockwaves through Vasper's body, stealing the air from his lungs and the strength from his limbs. He plummeted from the sky like a stone, his body lifeless and limp, as if every ounce of his power had been drained in an instant. But Jake wasn't finished. As Vasper fell, careening towards the jagged rocks below, Jake was already there, waiting on the ground. The moment Vasper's body made contact, Jake caught him, only to slam him down with another bone-crushing blow to the chest against a massive boulder. The impact was so violent that the rock beneath them shattered, sending shards flying in all directions as blood spread across Vasper's back, staining the broken stone. "I've waited a long time for this, Vasper," Jake muttered, his voice low and filled with grim satisfaction. His determination to end Vasper was absolute, a cold fury that demanded finality. But as Jake prepared to deliver the killing blow, something flickered in Vasper's eyes, a burning desire for vengeance, a fire that refused to be extinguished. With a surge of energy that defied his battered state, Vasper's hand shot out, clamping around Jake's throat in a vice-like grip. In an instant, they teleported, the world around them blurring as Vasper's intentions became clear, to drown Jake with his yacht in the depths of the ocean. Jake struggled against the unrelenting hold, but Vasper's fury made him stronger, his power fueled by rage and desperation. With a roar, Vasper slammed Jake's body into the center of the ruined yacht, the force driving Jake through the deck and creating a gaping hole. Seawater rushed in, flooding the yacht at a terrifying pace, as Vasper held Jake under the rising water, determined to end his life while the vessel sank beneath the waves. Desperation clawed at Jake as he fought to breathe, his lungs burning with the need for air. In a last-ditch effort, he summoned his teleportation power, and in a flash, they both reappeared on the shoreline. Jake, gasping for breath, quickly regained his stance and launched a furious barrage of punches at Vasper's face and chest, each blow fueled by raw, unbridled fury. Vasper was sent crashing into a massive rock, but before he could even hit the ground, Jake teleported in front of him, continuing his relentless assault. The sound of their fists colliding echoed like thunder across the island, a violent symphony of power and rage. Both men were now on high alert, their bodies tense and coiled like predators ready to strike. They circled each other, neither willing to give an inch. Vasper's eyes flicked to the spot where Jake's yacht had once been, it was now completely submerged beneath the waves. The memory of seeing Chanty's lingerie displayed on that yacht, as if Jake were taunting him, ignited a fresh wave of fury in Vasper. To him, it wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a sacred symbol of his bond with Chanty, something no one else had the right to touch. The thought of Jake holding it, perhaps even inhaling its scent, was an act of utter disrespect, a violation of something deeply personal and sacred between him and Chanty. It was an unforgivable act in Vasper's eyes, a desecration of something sacred and personal between him and Chanty. His eyes blazing with hatred, Vasper spat forcefully on the ground as he glared at Jake. Jake, equally enraged by the destruction Vasper had caused and the theft of Chanty's lingerie, felt his anger rise to a blazing inferno. It might seem absurd that such a brutal battle was sparked by a single piece of white lingerie, but to both men, it was the catalyst for this deadly encounter. To Vasper, it was a violation of something deeply personal, a desecration of his bond with Chanty. To Jake, it was a symbol of what he believed Chanty deserved, a life free from Vasper's shadow. They both stood tall, radiating power and defiance. "It's time for you to stop being delusional, Jake," Vasper sneered, his voice laced with venom. "Can't you find a woman you can truly call your own? Or are you simply too inexperienced to know how?" Jake only chuckled, a dark and dangerous sound. "Chanty belongs to me, Vasper. The time will come when she'll be with me. She's only blinded by you because you're her first love, but you're not her true love. Look at how miserable her life is with you. She's guilty because of Samara, but that won't happen when she's with me, Vasper. I can introduce her to the world, I won't be ashamed of her, and she won't have to hide from the public. She needs to wake up before it's too late, and I won't leave until she realizes I'm the one she should choose, not you." Vasper stared at Jake in disbelief, the depth of Jake's obsession with Chanty hitting him like a punch to the gut. It mirrored the intensity of Samara's fixation on him, and it disgusted him. Shaking his head, Vasper muttered, "I'm speechless, Jake. You're just like Samara, stubborn and blind to reality. You should go back to Samara, Vasper." "The two of you are perfect together," Jake retorted, his tone sharp and cutting. "Samara is hot and beautiful, what more could you want from her? Or are you after someone younger, like Chanty?" As he spoke, Jake spat forcefully in front of Vasper, further inflaming Vasper's anger with the brazen insult. "Watch your mouth, Jake, or I'll cut out your tongue." Vasper's voice was a deadly warning, every word a promise of violence. "You and Samara deserve each other, you're both delusional." "No thanks, Vasper," Jake sneered. "You can have her, she's all yours." "But Chanty is mine." Hearing this, Vasper's laughter echoed across the island, a sound filled with dark intent, as both men prepared for the next round of their battle, their hatred for each other burning hotter than ever. Vasper and Jake stood, their bodies barely clad, with only their tattered pants clinging to them, now ripped and torn. Their muscular physiques were on full display, a mix of sweat and blood tracing the contours of their defined physiques. Their hair was disheveled, their faces bloodied, yet their striking handsomeness and allure remained undiminished. Both exuded power, their stances commanding and their movements unshakable, exuding raw power, every movement calculated and deadly, their eyes locked in a battle of wills. But there was no denying it, Vasper was leading this fight. Vasper's name was legendary, even in the inner world. His ferocious battle within the dragon's lair, all for the coveted tears of dragon crystals. That mission had earned him the title of Alexander Mondragon's heir. Jake knew exactly who he was up against, but it didn't matter. For Chanty, Jake was prepared to face anyone, even Alexander Mondragon himself, the last pure-blood fallen angel. Vasper couldn't help but admire Jake's abilities. The rumors were true, Jake was the only one who could match Vasper's speed and strength. He could see Jake's power growing, his wounds healing within minutes, the gashes on his face and body closing rapidly. They circled each other like predators, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Their steps as graceful as a lion's, yet as swift as lightning, fast and precise. Their eyes blazed with the desire to end this battle. Neither willing to be the one to surrender, neither willing to lose. "Jake, I have planned to finish you today," Vasper spoke, his voice carrying the weight of authority and finality, leaving no room for doubt. "Because you've become too much of a nuisance. And you've crossed too many lines. You've disrespected my rightful place in Chanty's life. When will you accept that she's mine and nothing you do will change that? And you'll never have her?" No matter how many illusions you create, there's no hope for you, Jake. She will never leave my side. Only death can separate us. Remember that." Vasper's words were like a blade, sharp and cutting deep, and Jake's response was a mocking laugh, filled with defiance. The sound echoed in the night, taunting. Vasper's thoughts churned as he touched the suspended bracelet secured in his pocket. A quick glance at his watch showed it was 2 a.m. He needed to finish this fight quickly and return to Chanty. Jake's mocking laughter vanished as he suddenly disappeared from Vasper's sight. Vasper's senses heightened, every nerve on edge, his focus laser-sharp as he scanned his surroundings. In an instant, Jake reappeared right in front of him, brandishing a sword made of crystals from the inner world. This was no ordinary, and Vasper knew it well. He recognized the weapon instantly and knew its deadly power. The blade was dangerous, its wounds difficult to heal even with his powers. The wounds it inflicted would not be easy to heal, even with his formidable abilities. Jake's laughter echoed, deranged, as he lunged with the sword at lightning speed, his eyes wild as he lunged at Vasper with the sword. But Vasper was just as fast, dodging each deadly swipe with a grace that's supernatural. The sound of the blade cutting through the air was like a relentless storm, its speed and force deadly, the sound of its swings like thunderclaps, relentless in its pursuit of blood. The clashing of their powers and abilities reverberated through the night, the sound of their battle merging with the furious swipes of the sword, the night alive with the sound of their battle, as if the very elements were echoing their fury. Vasper seized a brief opportunity to kick Jake in the back, sending him crashing into a large tree, the force of the impact toppling it, in a flash. Vasper was upon him, delivering a crushing blow to Jake's chest and then stomping on his arm, the one holding the sword. Jake screamed in agony, his cry echoing across the island, like a dying animal's. Vasper wrenched the sword from Jake's grasp. And in a swift motion, Jake managed to rise to his feet once more, rising from the ground with a determination that refused to die. But when he stood, everything around him changed. They were no longer on his private paradise, they were on a small, desolate island, with Vasper standing before him, grinning, the crystal sword gleaming in his hand. As Vasper approached, Jake tried to remain alert, but his body felt impossibly heavy, his strength ebbing away like the tide. Vasper's laughter rang in his ears as Jake struggled to maintain his balance, his legs buckling beneath him. Jake's confusion deepened as his vision blurred, Vasper's figure becoming hazy and indistinct. Fear gripped Jake, he couldn't see Vasper clearly anymore. Desperation clawed at him. If Vasper attacked now, Jake wouldn't be able to defend himself. In desperation, in a last-ditch effort, he attempted to teleport back to his island, but nothing happened. They were still on the same spot, the landscape remained the same, bleak, desolate, and unforgiving. With Vasper standing in front of him, unmoved. Vasper stepped closer, and with one swift fluid motion, slashed Jake across the stomach with the sword. The pain was excruciating, searing through Jake's entire being, and he groaned, clutching the deep wound, knowing it was severe, knowing how deep it was, how serious. But then, Vasper did the unexpected, he tossed the sword aside, much to Jake's surprise. Jake struggled to focus on Vasper's face, he couldn't see Vasper's face clearly, only his silhouette. "Jake," Vasper's voice was deep, serious, with a chilling finality. "On this island, there's no water, no food. Nothing but sea and sand, but for someone wounded like you, you won't last 3 days. Consider it my mercy that you'll die this way, and not by my hands, but by the elements." Vasper's tone grew colder, more resolute. "Look at your hand. You're wearing the suspended bracelet. You're just an ordinary man now, for the next 3 days. If you can survive that long. This place is far from your mansion. Farewell, Jake. This is the price you pay for your stubbornness and lack of respect." And with that, Vasper vanished, leaving Jake alone on the cold, unforgiving island. Panic set in, surged through Jake as he looked down at his hand, feeling the icy chill of the bracelet that now shackled him. Only now did he realize the full extent of his situation. His arm was numb from where Vasper had stomped on it earlier. He pulled at the bracelet desperately, but it wouldn't budge. Desperation clawed at him in the darkness. Desperation gripped him as he realized the severity of his situation. his body racked with pain from the wound and his stomach burning like fire. He was shirtless, his body weakening with every passing moment. Thirst gnawed at him, his throat dry, his mouth parched. The wounds on his body and face burned with a searing pain, and the coldness of the night air bit into his skin, adding to his exhaustion. He crawled towards the sword Vasper had thrown aside, each movement a struggle as his vision darkened, until finally, he lost consciousness. Meanwhile, Vasper stood beneath the cascading water of the shower in his mansion's lavish bathroom. The water poured over his chiseled form, mingling with the remnants of blood and grains of sand from the shoreline, all swirling together down the drain. His expression remained eerily calm, utterly untroubled by what he had done to Jake. As the realization settled in, he glanced at his left wrist, noticing the absence of the unique watch he had worn, a casualty of their fierce battle. He closed his eyes, feeling a brief pang of loss. That watch had been one of a kind, crafted exclusively for him, a piece irreplaceable not just in value but in significance. Yet, he dismissed the thought, after all, he could commission another, though the artisan who created it had long since passed away, taking his unrivaled skill with him to the grave. Vasper shook his head, letting the water cascade over him one last time before stepping out, his movements precise and swift as he lathered himself with soap and shampoo. Emerging from the steam-filled bathroom, he dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, readying himself to escort Chanty to the vineyard meeting. As he toweled off his hair, his eyes flicked to the clock, 4 a.m. Not a wink of sleep had touched him all night, the battle with Jake on the island still fresh in his mind. But his strength had returned, renewed and powerful. A sardonic smile curled his lips as he recalled the look on Jake's face when he had placed the suspended bracelet on him, robbing him of his power. That desperate expression was a sweet victory, a testament to his triumph. "You'll need a miracle to survive on that island, Jake," Vasper murmured to the empty air, his voice a mere whisper of contempt. Once he was satisfied with his reflection in the mirror, he teleported to Chanty's room, ensuring he remained undetected by the 3 guardians assigned to protect her. Cloaked in an invisible shield, he moved silently. Upon arriving in the room, his breath hitched as his body temperature spiked, a visceral reaction to the sight before him. Chanty lay there, asleep, her body curled on its side, the oversized t-shirt she wore riding up, revealing the exquisite contrast of her delicate black lace lingerie against her flawless skin. The sight of her luscious curves, the sculpted length of her legs, sent a surge of heat through him. She slept soundly, her hair cascading across the pillow. With painstaking slowness, Vasper moved closer, his eyes devouring every inch of her form. She was the woman he adored beyond reason, the cause of the violent clash between him and Jake. Her face, an intoxicating blend of angelic purity and devilish seduction, with lips slightly parted, seemed to beg for a kiss. Chanty was blissfully unaware of his presence, an unnerving realization that sent a cold shiver down his spine. What if it had been Jake who found her like this? What if Jake had teleported into her room in this very moment? Twice already, Jake had seen Chanty unclothed, memories Vasper had glimpsed through her thoughts. The thought made Vasper clench his jaw in simmering rage. And this was precisely why he felt no remorse for leaving Jake stranded on that island. Vasper shrugged off his jacket, draping it over the bench at the foot of the bed. Despite his recent shower, heat surged through him again, beads of sweat forming at his temples and trickling down his neck, even dampening his chest. He unbuttoned his long-sleeved shirt, each motion deliberate, before settling beside Chanty, facing her. It was as if he were under a spell, his gaze tracing the contours of her face, down the length of her body, and to her toes. A faint smile curved his lips as he drank in her beauty, his desire for her growing almost unbearable. Even as his body burned with longing, he refused to disturb her peaceful slumber. Carefully, he eased himself down beside her, his movements cautious, ensuring the bed didn't shift under their combined weight. He was so close now that the overpowering urge to touch her, to taste her lips, caused his heart to pound in his chest. Her lips, slightly parted, seemed to pull him closer, while the curve of her waist beckoned for his embrace, and the sight of her legs enticed him. Her entire figure, so tantalizingly close, was a vision of seductive agony, torturing him as he fought to restrain himself. "Chanty, I love you so much," he whispered into the air, his voice too soft to rouse her. As if in response, Chanty shifted, a soft moan escaping her lips, further igniting the fire within him. Vasper's body reacted instantly, a primal wave of arousal coursing through him. Suddenly, Chanty rolled onto her back, her legs parting, one draped lazily over her pillow, leaving her in a pose so inviting that the delicate black lace of her lingerie barely covered her most intimate parts. Vasper let out a shaky breath, his teeth sinking into his lower lip as he forced himself to close his eyes, trying to block out the maddening sight. "You can do this, Vasper. Just ignore it and go to sleep," he told himself, but his body trembled, every muscle tense with desire. He nudged the blanket at the foot of the bed with his foot, gently pulling it over Shanta's exposed lower body, breathing a small sigh of relief as her tempting form was finally hidden from view. A faint smile of satisfaction touched his lips as he closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, even if only for a moment. But sleep was elusive. His gaze kept returning to Shanta's face, mesmerized by the rise and fall of her chest with each breath she took. Jake's words about Chanty echoed in his mind, a lingering reminder of the danger they faced. "Just a little longer, Chanty, and we'll have total freedom." "Don't ever let go of me," Vasper whispered, his voice so soft that only he could hear it, the words a vow, a promise sealed in the quiet of the early morning. Then he decided to close his eyes. As if the world held its breath, Vasper barely had time to close his eyes before Chanty shifted beside him. She turned toward him in her sleep, her delicate hand resting on his chest, where his shirt was already unbuttoned, revealing his bare skin. The skin-to-skin contact sent a jolt of electricity through Vasper's entire body, sending a shiver of awareness through every fiber of Vasper's being. Even in her slumber, Shanta's presence ignited a storm within him, her touch stirring something deep and primal. His eyes snapped open, locking onto her with a burning intensity, the kind of desire that could no longer suppress. Without a second thought, driven by an impulse he couldn't control, in a swift movement, Vasper teleported them to the serene isolation of their island beach, their bodies landing softly on the bed. The abrupt change in surroundings jolted Chanty awake, her eyes fluttering open in confusion. She stared blankly at the ceiling, disoriented, as if awakening from a dream. Before she could fully comprehend what had happened, Vasper captured her mouth in a fervent kiss. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her lips, though his actions spoke of a hunger that could no longer be denied, but Chanty already knew what was happening as soon as his lips touched hers. The familiar ceiling above her, the intensity of his kiss, everything fell into place for Chanty. Vasper's kiss was searing, desperate, his longing for her overwhelming. Full of longing and desire, desperate to possess her at that moment. His mouth sought hers with an intense, almost feverish passion. He needed her, right here, right now. Her lips parted, surrendering to the fervor of his kiss, allowing his tongue to sweep into her mouth, claiming her as if this was their last moment together. Vasper's groan reverberated through the room, a raw sound filled with the heat of his need. His hands moved with reverence, worshipping Shanta's breasts, as her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers threading through his hair. She yielded completely to him, her body arching into his touch, surrendering to the desperate need that consumed them both. One hand caressed her breast, while Vasper's mouth left a trail of fire as it moved down to her breasts, his lips and tongue alternating between them, driving Chanty to the brink. She moaned deeply, the sound vibrating through her as it fueled the fire within Vasper. His hand slid to the edge of her lingerie, and with a swift movement, he pulled it down. Chanty lifted her hips, helping him remove her panties, her body aching for his touch. And Vasper seemingly intoxicated as Chanty spread her legs open in front of him, his gaze feasting on her. Vasper's hand moved, found its way between her thighs, his fingers exploring with a thirst that mirrored his own need, while his mouth continued its worship of her breasts. Chanty gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts as she chased the pleasure his touch brought, the heat in her core building to an unbearable intensity. Each second intensified the pleasure she felt, as if her body were ablaze. "I love you, Chanty," Vasper whispered against her lips, his kiss now possessive, consuming her breath as if it were his own. Chanty responded with a deep moan, her voice trembling with the depth of her desire. Vasper's mouth began its descent, tracing a path down her body, from her stomach to her navel, until he reached the sensitive skin just above her core. Chanty's stomach quivered with anticipation, her breath hitching as his fingers continued their relentless teasing of her most sensitive spot. When Vasper's mouth finally descended to her most sensitive flesh, a sharp gasp tore from Shanta's lips, her mouth falling open as she struggled to breathe, gasping for air. The pleasure within her surged, growing more intense with every passing moment as Vasper's tongue, skilled and insatiable, played and teased her, satisfying a need only he could fulfill. Shanta's hands and fingers were now in Vasper's hair, pushing his head down as she chased the exquisite pleasure that only he could give. Vasper's hands cupped her breasts, kneading them gently, as his groans vibrated against her, and combined with the deliberate play of his tongue and lips, drew deep, intense moans from Chanty. She repeatedly murmured Vasper's name like a mantra, as her breath quickened, and as she neared the edge of her climax, her body tensed, reacting wildly. Vasper sensed how close she was, his grip on her breasts tightening, his tongue moving faster, more determined. "Give it to me, Chanty." Vasper's voice was a rough whisper against her sensitive flesh, urging her on. And then it hit, a wave of ecstasy so powerful it felt as though time itself had slowed. Shanta's body moved as if in slow motion, every muscle coiling with tension as she finally reached her climax. A deep and prolonged moan escaping her lips as her fingers gripped Vasper's hair tighter, her strength channeled through that hold, grounding herself in the pleasure he gave her. His tongue maintained its steady, deliberate pace, ensuring Chanty could fully savor the pleasure without it ending too quickly. Ensuring that she felt every wave of ecstasy that coursed through her. Vasper could feel her muscles contracting as her body released the essence of her pleasure, and he eagerly took in everything she offered, determined to draw out her climax to its fullest, ensuring she reached the peak of her euphoria. It took a moment for Shanta's body to stop trembling, her breath still coming in deep, heavy gasps. Vasper, with slow and careful movements, savored every drop that flowed from her, while her body occasionally twitched from the lingering sensitivity, but she let Vasper continue, knowing he was the only one who could handle the aftermath of such intense pleasure. Finally, Vasper crawled back up to her body, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both passionate and tender, filled with the depth of his love. "I love you so much," he whispered between kisses. "I missed you," he muttered against her lips. "I love you too, Vasper," Chanty replied, her voice soft and breathless. Her hands moved to his chest, sliding his long-sleeve shirt off his shoulders, the buttons already undone. As they continued kissing, Shanta's hands found the waistband of Vasper's pants, her fingers teased the waistband of his briefs, her touch deliberate, sending shivers of anticipation down his spine. She felt the hardness of his arousal pressing against her, and without breaking their kiss, she deftly unbuttoning and unzipping them, she helped him remove his pants. With the pants gone, Shanta's hand slipped inside his briefs, her touch driving him wild, increasing the intensity and depth of his groans. She moved with a languid grace, her fingers finally inside to wrap around the hard, pulsing length of him. The moment she made contact, Vasper's breath caught in his throat, his body reacting as if electrified. Vasper's deep, guttural groan was his only response to Shanta's touch. His eyes, dark with desire, locked onto hers, the intensity of his need reflected in every line of his face. What had been a passionate kiss now turned desperate and heated, fueled by a hunger that neither could resist, a need that demanded to be fulfilled. Her touch was gentle at first, almost teasing, as she began a slow, deliberate stroke, her fingers tracing every ridge and contour, exploring the rigid heat of his arousal. Vasper's breath hitched, his entire body tensing under the pleasure she was beginning to weave around him. His control, always so firm, started to slip as Shanta's pace remained slow, excruciatingly so, each movement of her hand designed to draw out his pleasure, to make him feel every inch of it. Shanta leaned in closer, her lips brushing against the sensitive skin of his neck, leaving a trail of soft, lingering kisses along his skin, her breath warm and tantalizing. Each kiss was like a spark, igniting the fire already burning within him. Vasper's head fell back, his eyes closing as he surrendered to the sensation she was building within him. Her lips traveled down his chest, her tongue occasionally flicking out to taste his skin, making him shudder beneath her touch, sending waves of pleasure rippling through his body. The contrast between her soft, gentle kisses and the firm, rhythmic strokes of her hand was driving him to the brink of madness, every nerve in his body alive with sensation, the slow pace she maintained only heightening his need for release. As she kissed her way down his torso, Shanta's pace remained slow, deliberate, each touch designed to draw out his pleasure, to make him feel every exquisite second of it. Her hand tightened slightly around him, her strokes becoming firmer, more assured. Vasper's hands clenched the sheets beside him, his knuckles white with the effort to hold on, his breath coming in ragged bursts as he struggled to hold on, to not lose himself too quickly in the overwhelming pleasure she was giving him. The need coursing through him was almost unbearable, a visceral, primal force that demanded release. But Chanty was relentless. She reached the waistband of his briefs, her breath warm against his skin, sending a shiver through his entire body. With agonizing slowness, she pulled the fabric down, freeing him completely. The moment her lips descended on him, Vasper's body jerked, a deep, guttural moan escaping from deep within his chest. Chanty's touch was nothing short of exquisite. Her mouth was a hot, wet paradise, her lips wrapping around him with a perfect, torturous heat. She moved slowly, her tongue swirling around him, her pace unhurried but intentional, designed to drive him closer and closer to the edge with every movement. Vasper's hands found their way to her hair, his fingers threading through the soft strands, guiding her, urging her to continue. Each time she took him deeper into her mouth, he felt his control slipping further, the need for release building into an unstoppable force. Chanty's name fell from his lips in a ragged whisper like a prayer, his voice thick with desperation and need. She could feel him tense beneath her, his body coiling like a spring ready to snap, and she knew he was close. His body taut with anticipation, every muscle straining as he hovered on the brink. But she didn't rush. Instead, she slowed her pace even more, her movements teasing, drawing out the pleasure until it bordered on pain. Designed to push him closer to the edge. Vasper's breath was coming in short, sharp bursts, his entire body trembling with the effort to hold on, to not lose himself too quickly. Chanty, his voice was a low, desperate growl, filled with a plea for release. Finally, sensing that he was at his limit, Chanty tightened her grip, her pace increasing just enough to tip him over the edge, her lips and tongue working together in perfect harmony to drive him over the edge. Vasper's grip on her hair tightened as his entire body tensed, every muscle coiling, his breath hitched, his chest heaving, as he teetered on the brink of release. The pleasure was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to consume him, every nerve ending on fire, the pleasure so intense it was almost painful. And then, with one final, perfect movement of her mouth, Chanty sent him spiraling into ecstasy. Vasper's body jerked, his head falling back as a low, primal growl erupted from deep within him, his release hitting him like a tidal wave. The intensity of it was overwhelming, his entire body shaking as Chanty continued her slow, deliberate movements, drawing out his pleasure until there was nothing left but the raw, visceral sensation of his climax. Chanty didn't stop, her mouth and hands continuing their gentle, deliberate movements, drawing out his pleasure until he was completely spent. She had taken everything he had to give, his body trembling with the aftershocks of his release. Only when she was sure he had nothing left to give did she slowly pull back, her lips trailing soft kisses along his inner thighs as she moved back up his body. Vasper lay there, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to recover, his body trembling as the last waves of pleasure washed over him. His eyes, heavy-lidded and dark with satisfaction, met Chanty's, a look of pure, unadulterated adoration in them. "Chanty," he whispered, his voice rough, filled with a depth of emotion that words could barely convey. He pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that spoke of the love, the gratitude, and the reverence he felt for her. "I love you," he murmured against her lips, his voice soft but filled with an intensity that left no doubt of his sincerity. "I love you so much." Chanty smiled against his lips, her heart swelling with love for him, for this man who had given her everything. "I love you too, Vasper," she whispered back, her voice trembling with the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. They lay there together, their bodies intertwined, their hearts beating in perfect harmony. In the aftermath of their shared passion, there was a stillness, a peace that settled over them, the world outside their intimate bubble fading away. They were all that mattered, their love, their connection, stronger than ever before. Vasper's hand stroked Chanty's hair, his touch gentle, as if she were the most precious thing in the world to him. "You're everything to me," he murmured, his voice filled with awe and reverence. Chanty's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her heart overflowing with love for the man who held her so tenderly, so completely. "And you're my world, Vasper," she replied, her voice soft, but the words carrying the weight of her deepest emotions.